Arlington, Virginia, 1950. The amber liquid swirled in Jack Thornton's glass, catching the dim light of the bar. His weathered hand gripped the tumbler with a soldier's strength, though the war had been over 5 years now. The television mounted in the corner of the smoke-filled establishment flickered with black and white footage. Most patrons paid it no mind, but Jack couldn't tear his eyes away. Korea. Another war. Another generation of young men. The news anchor's voice droned on about communist aggression and North Korean tanks rolling across the 38th parallel. Jack knew what those boys faced better than most. At 58, his hair had gone steel gray, matching the tanks he once commanded, but his eyes remained sharp blue and alert, taking in every detail of the grainy footage. "Looks bad over there, doesn't it, Colonel?" The bartender slid another whiskey across the worn wooden counter. "It's just Jack now," he corrected, quietly pushing the fresh drink aside. And yes, those boys are in trouble. The footage showed American troops retreating. What caught Jack's attention were the fleeting images of burning tanks, American M24 Chaffies no match for the Soviet T-34s the North Koreans were using. History repeating itself yet again. Men sent to fight with inferior equipment. Men sent to die. The telephone behind the bar rang, breaking his concentration. The bartender answered with a nod, then held the receiver out toward Jack. "Call for you." Jack frowned. Nobody called him here. Few people even knew this was where he spent his evenings. "Thornton," he said, taking the receiver, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man who had commanded men in battle. "Colonel Thornton, General Maxwell Davis here." Jack straightened instinctively at the sound of his old commander's voice. They had fought across Europe together, members of the legendary 761st Tank Battalion, the first predominantly African-American armored unit in U.S. history. Jack had been one of the few white officers assigned to the unit. Together, they had fought not just the Germans, but prejudice and doubt from their own side. "Max, been a long time." "Too long, Jack. We need to talk. I'm sending a car. This isn't a request." Jack stared at the television screen, where young men huddled behind a burning tank. Something cold and heavy settled in his stomach. "This about Korea?" "The car will be there in 10 minutes. The line went dead. Jack placed the receiver down slowly, his mind already racing through calculations of armor thickness, effective ranges, ammunition types. The knowledge was still there, burned into his mind by 4 years of brutal combat. Knowledge he had tried to drown in whiskey for half a decade. "I'm retired," he muttered to no one in particular as he laid cash on the counter. Their war, not mine anymore. But even as he spoke the words, Jack knew he was lying to himself. The Pentagon loomed against the evening sky, massive and imposing. The car had delivered Jack directly to a side entrance where General Davis himself waited. The years had added weight to the general's frame and silver to his temples, but he still carried himself with the same quiet dignity Jack remembered. "You look like hell, Jack." Davis extended his hand. Jack shook it firmly. "Retirement suits me." Davis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's skip the small talk. We've got a situation that needs your expertise." They walked through sterile corridors, Jack's civilian attire drawing curious glances from uniformed personnel. His worn leather jacket and plain clothes stood in stark contrast to the military precision surrounding him. Yet something in his bearing, the way he moved, caused junior officers to unconsciously straighten as he passed. Davis led him to a conference room where several senior officers sat around a table. Maps of the Korean peninsula covered one wall marked with red arrows showing North Korean advances. The room fell silent as Jack entered. "Gentlemen, this is Colonel Jack Thornton." Davis introduced him. "One of the finest tank commanders this country has ever produced." A thin, red-faced man at the head of the table scowled. "We're bringing in retired personnel now?" "No disrespect, Colonel, but surely we have active duty officers who can advise on this situation." "Colonel Thornton has more combat experience against Soviet armor than anyone else in this building, General Harrison," Davis replied coolly. "He destroyed 27 enemy tanks personally during the European campaign." Jack ignored the exchange, his attention fixed on the tactical maps. The situation was worse than the news had reported. American and South Korean forces were retreating on all fronts. "You're getting slaughtered," Jack stated bluntly. The room went silent. Davis nodded to an aide who dimmed the lights and started a film projector. "This footage arrived yesterday. It's been classified." The black and white images showed American M24 Chaffee tanks engaging North Korean T-34s. The results were devastating. The lighter American tanks couldn't penetrate the T-34's armor from the front, while the Soviet 85mm guns were tearing through the Chaffies with terrifying ease. Jack watched expressionless as young men died in burning metal coffins. The same way his friends had died in the Ardennes when American Shermans proved inadequate against German Panthers and Tigers. The memories flooded back with visceral clarity, the smell of burning fuel and flesh, the screams over the radio. "Our boys are outgunned and outarmored," Davis said when the lights came back on. "The M24 is a reconnaissance tank never meant to engage heavy armor. The M26 Pershing would be a match for the T-34, but you don't have enough of them, and deployment would take too long." Jack finished for him. Davis nodded grimly. "Exactly." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only when Jack finally spoke. "So what do you want from me? A pep talk? Tactical advice? I left this life behind. We need you to lead a special project." Davis placed a folder on the table. "We're facing the same situation we did in Europe, and for our current tanks can't handle what they're up against. But we learned some lessons last time around." Jack opened the folder. Inside were technical specifications, vehicle assessments, and production timelines. "These are impossible schedules," he said after scanning the documents. "You can't develop and field new tanks in these timeframes. That's why we're not talking about new tanks." Davis leaned forward. "We're talking about modifying what we already have, quickly, effectively, under the radar." The twist hit Jack like a physical blow. He looked up sharply, meeting Davis's gaze. "You want me to upgrade existing tanks, create stopgap solutions?" "Exactly. The M26 production is ramping up, but those boys in Korea don't have months to wait. They need something now." General Harrison interjected, his voice dripping with skepticism. "This is highly irregular. We have protocols, development pipelines. You can't just cobble together battle tanks like hot rods in someone's garage." Jack almost smiled. That was exactly what they had done in Europe when necessity demanded field modifications, improvised armor, improved sighting mechanisms. The difference between theory and practice, the gap between the Pentagon and the front lines. Davis ignored Harrison, continuing. "Jack, we need someone who understands both the technical aspects and the combat realities. Someone who can think outside traditional channels." Jack closed the folder, his mind already calculating possibilities. "You're asking me to create a miracle." "I'm asking you to save lives," Davis countered. "American lives." The room waited as Jack stood and walked to the map, studying the tactical situation. Finally, he turned back to face them. "I'll do it on one condition: complete autonomy. I select my team, I select my equipment, I make the modifications I see fit. No committees, no bureaucracy, no red tape." Harrison sputtered in protest, but Davis raised a hand, silencing him. "Agreed, you'll have whatever you need." Jack nodded once. "Then let's get started." The Aberdeen Proving Ground spread out before them, a massive complex of testing facilities and storage areas where the Army evaluated new vehicles and weapons. But Jack had asked to see a specific section tucked away from the main facilities: the tank graveyard. Hundreds of vehicles sat in neat rows stretching to the horizon. Shermans, Stuarts, Hellcats, veterans of a war already fading from public memory. Most were destined for scrap or foreign military aid, but for now they waited under the Maryland sun, forgotten soldiers of steel. Jack walked between the rows, his hand occasionally reaching out to touch a hull or turret. To the young lieutenant escorting him, these were just obsolete machines, but Jack saw each vehicle differently. He remembered the men who had fought and died in tanks just like these. "Sir, if I may ask, what exactly are we looking for?" The lieutenant struggled to keep pace with Jack's purposeful stride. "Recognition," Jack replied cryptically. He stopped suddenly before an M4A3E8 Sherman, the Easy 8 variant, with a more powerful 76mm gun and horizontal volute spring suspension. Unlike most vehicles in the yard, this one was in surprisingly good condition. Jack circled it once, then climbed up with an agility that belied his age. The commander's hatch opened with a familiar creak. Jack lowered himself into the turret muscle memory, guiding him to the commander's position. Inside the confined space, smelling of metal and old grease, he closed his eyes, momentarily transported back to 1944. The roar of the engine, the radio chatter, the concussion of the main gun firing. The Easy 8 had been the best Sherman variant, arriving too late to make a real difference in the European theater. "This one," Jack called out, climbing from the turret. "And I want every E8 you've got in running condition." The lieutenant looked confused. "Sir, these are scheduled for transfer to our allies. They're outdated." Jack fixed the young officer with a hard stare. "Son, outdated and useless aren't the same thing. These tanks have potential. They just need the right modifications." As they walked back toward the administration building, Jack spotted a fenced compound with military police standing guard. Inside were captured enemy vehicles, including several Soviet tanks. I need access to those as well, he pointed. Sir, that's restricted. Those are intelligence assets. Jack smiled thinly. Not anymore. They're now research assets for Project Lazarus. Project Lazarus, sir? Yes, Lieutenant. We're going to resurrect the dead. Jack stood in an office at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, reviewing personnel files. General Davis had given him access to military records, but Jack wasn't looking at active duty soldiers. He was looking for specific veterans, men who had served in armor units during the war. Men with particular skills and experience. The first file showed a Hispanic man in his mid-40s, Master Sergeant Miguel Wrench Rodriguez. He had served as a tank mechanic and maintenance chief with the 4th Armored Division, earning multiple commendations for keeping vehicles running under impossible conditions. His post-war record showed scattered employment at auto shops, but nothing lasting. Jack set the file aside. Rodriguez would be his first recruit. He found the sergeant living in a small apartment in Baltimore, working at a local garage. The man who opened the door bore little resemblance to his military photograph. Rodriguez was thinner, his face lined, but his eyes lit with recognition when he saw Jack. Colonel Thornton, what in God's name are you doing here? I need a tank mechanic, Sergeant, the best. Rodriguez laughed bitterly. I fix Buicks and Chevrolets now, Colonel. The Army didn't have much use for me after VJ Day. I'm not the Army, Jack replied. I'm putting together a team for a special project. Tanks, modifications, important work. Korea, Rodriguez asked perceptively. Jack nodded. Those boys getting chewed up? They need better equipment. Fast. I thought you might want to help make that happen. Rodriguez hesitated only briefly before asking, when do we start? One by one, Jack assembled his team, each member chosen for specific skills and experience. Captain Samuel Washington had served with Jack in the 761st. One of the few black officers to command a tank platoon in combat, he had returned home to work in an automobile factory in Detroit. When Jack found him, Washington was overseeing an assembly line, his engineering degree earning him a management position, but not the respect he deserved. They're using me as a showpiece, Jack, Washington confided as they sat in his modest home. First Negro supervisor. They parade me around when the newspapers come, but I can't get my designs considered. I need your engineering skills, Sam, and your combat experience. You understand how tanks work in theory and practice. Washington studied Jack carefully. This official? Semi, enough to matter. Who else have you got? Rodriguez for mechanical, looking for O'Neill for gunnery. Washington whistled. Frank O'Neill? The best shot in the European theater if he's sober. That's the challenge, Jack admitted. They found Master Sergeant Frank O'Neill in worse shape than expected. The former tank gunner who could hit a moving target at 1,000 yards was living in a rundown apartment in Boston, existing on a disability pension and whiskey. His right leg, badly damaged by shrapnel, had never healed properly. Go away, Jack. O'Neill didn't invite them in. I'm not what you remember. I need a gunnery expert, Frank. Someone who understands targeting systems and ammunition effects. I'm a drunk with a bum leg. Jack didn't blink. You're the best gunner I ever saw. And we're not asking you to fight just to make sure others can. O'Neill's hard expression softened slightly. Those kids in Korea, they're getting killed, aren't they? They need better weapons. O'Neill sighed heavily. Let me get my coat. The final core member of the team, Lieutenant Harold Doc Thompson, had been a medical officer attached to an armored division. Post-war, he'd established a small practice in Harlem, serving a community others neglected. I'm a doctor, not a tank engineer, Thompson protested when Jack explained the project. You understand what happens to men inside tanks when they're hit, Jack replied bluntly. You treated the survivors. You know what kills them. Burns, shrapnel, concussion. I need someone who thinks about crew survival, not just mechanical performance. Thompson removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. When you put it that way, how can I refuse? Within a week, Jack had assembled his core team, along with a dozen additional veterans, all experts in various aspects of armored warfare. They gathered at an abandoned manufacturing facility at Fort Belvoir that would serve as their workshop and headquarters. The cavernous space echoed with their footsteps as Jack led the team through for the first time. Overhead lights flickered, revealing a factory floor stripped of most equipment. Dust-covered windows allowed beams of morning light to slice through the gloom. This is it? Washington asked, looking skeptical. This is it, Jack confirmed. By next week, I want this place running 3 shifts. We'll have the first tanks delivered tomorrow. Rodriguez walked the floor, examining the remnants of machinery. We'll need tools, equipment, a lot of it. Make a list. You'll get what you need. O'Neill limped to a corner where office space overlooked the factory floor. Command center up there? Jack nodded. Engineering, design, and testing protocols. Washington, that's your domain. The men exchanged glances, uncertainties and questions evident on their faces. Jack could feel their doubts. They were has-beens recalled for a last-ditch effort. Forgotten men tasked with saving lives half a world away. I know what you're thinking. Jack addressed them directly. Why us? Why now? The military has younger men, active duty personnel with access to the latest technology. Why recall a bunch of aging veterans for this job? He paused, allowing their question to hang in the air. Because we've been there. We know what it means to be outgunned and out-armored on a battlefield. We've watched friends die because their equipment wasn't good enough. We've improvised, modified, and adapted to survive. That's experience you can't get from a manual. The men straightened their postures, changing subtly as Jack spoke a remnant of military bearing, returning to civilian bodies. This isn't a theoretical exercise for us, it's personal. The Army needs stopgap solutions while the next generation of tanks goes into full production. We're going to give those boys in Korea a fighting chance. Jack walked to a large blueprint table in the center of the floor, unrolling technical drawings of the M4A3E8 Sherman. Gentlemen, we start with what we know, the Sherman, reliable, maneuverable, producible, but undergunned and under-armored for what they're facing in Korea. Washington stepped forward, examining the drawings. The T-34 has sloped armor and an 85mm gun, heavier but still fast. Exactly. We need to match or exceed that capability using existing platforms and available components. Rodriguez joined them at the table. Engine and transmission can handle more weight. Not much more, but some. What about the gun? O'Neill asked. The 76mm was barely adequate against German armor. Jack smiled for the first time. That's where our second advantage comes in. Follow me. He led them to a secured storage area at the back of the facility. Inside, under tarps, were several crated weapons. Experimental 90mm anti-tank guns, developed late in the war, never widely fielded, similar to what they're putting in the new Pershing tanks, but more compact. I've secured a dozen with mounting systems. O'Neill's eyes widened as he inspected one of the guns. These will punch through T-34 armor even at range, but the recoil will require reinforcement of the turret mounting and recoil systems. Washington finished. It's doable, though. Jack nodded. That's just the start. We've also acquired technical documents from captured German designs. Their concepts for sloped armor and ammunition storage were ahead of ours. How long do we have? Thompson asked the question they were all thinking. 6 weeks to deliver the first combat-ready prototypes, 3 months for a full complement. The team exchanged glances. The timeline was nearly impossible. One more thing. Jack's expression grew more serious. This project has enemies within our own ranks. People who think it's a waste of resources or who have competing priorities. General Harrison chief among them. He'll be looking for any excuse to shut us down. Politics, Washington spat the word. Politics that could cost lives, Jack agreed. So we keep our heads down, focus on results, and deliver ahead of schedule. The men nodded, understanding the stakes. All right then. Jack rolled up the blueprints. We start at 0600 tomorrow. Dismissed. 3 days later, the first Sherman tanks arrived on flatbed trailers. 8 E8 models in various states of repair. As they were offloaded onto the concrete apron outside the facility, the team gathered to inspect their raw materials. Rodriguez circled each vehicle, making notes on a clipboard. 4 are fully operational, 2 need engine work, all need track replacement and new radios. Washington focused on the turrets, already calculating the modifications needed to accommodate the larger gun. We'll need to extend the recoil system and reinforce the mounting. The turret ring should handle it, though. O'Neill climbed into one turret, checking the sighting mechanisms and gun controls. Fire control systems are garbage, need complete replacement. Jack listened to their assessments, nodding. These men knew their business. Within hours, the factory floor had transformed into a hive of activity. The first Sherman was already being stripped down, Rodriguez's team swarming over it like surgeons preparing for a complex operation. In the command center upstairs, Washington had assembled an engineering team, creating detailed modification plans. The walls were covered with technical drawings, ammunition penetration tables, and T-34 schematics. Jack moved between groups, answering questions, making decisions, keeping the project moving forward. By evening, the first tank had been completely disassembled, its components spread across the factory floor for inspection and modification. Colonel Thornton, a voice called from the entrance. Jack turned to see a military police officer standing at attention. Yes, Sergeant? Sir General Harrison is here to inspect the facility. Jack's expression hardened, but he nodded. Show him in. General Richard Harrison entered, flanked by aides, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid. He surveyed the factory with obvious disdain. Colonel Thornton, I see you've wasted no time spending the Army's money on this project of yours. General Harrison, to what do we owe this visit? Harrison walked slowly, examining the disassembled Sherman components. Oversight, Colonel. This project represents a significant allocation of resources that could be directed to established weapons programs. We're well within budget, General, and ahead of schedule. Harrison picked up a modified armor plate, turning it in his hands. You really believe you can turn these obsolete relics into effective fighting vehicles? I do, sir, and so does every man working here. Harrison set the plate down with deliberate care. I've reviewed your personnel files, Colonel, a collection of burnouts and misfits, men who couldn't adjust to civilian life or military discipline. Jack stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure only Harrison could hear. These burnouts and misfits have more combat experience than your entire staff combined, General. They know what works in the field, not just on paper. Careful, Colonel. You may have General Davis's protection, but that only extends so far. Is there something specific I can help you with, General? We have work to do. Harrison smiled thinly. Just conducting my due diligence, Colonel. I'll be watching this project very carefully. Very carefully indeed. After Harrison departed, Jack found Washington in the command center. We have a problem, Jack said without preamble. Washington looked up from his drawings. Harrison, he wants us to fail. He'll be documenting every setback, looking for any excuse to shut us down. Why? Jack sighed heavily. Because success for us means he was wrong. And men like Harrison can never be wrong. So what do? We work harder, faster, and we watch our backs. The project accelerated with the team working around the clock in 3 shifts. The first modified Sherman began to take shape. The turret had been extensively rebuilt to accommodate the 90mm gun. The hull armor was being augmented with additional plates angled to increase effective thickness without adding excessive weight. Jack often worked through the night, catching brief naps on a cot in his office. He was in the workshop early one morning when he noticed Rodriguez examining a strange component not from their inventory. What's that wrench? Rodriguez hesitated, then revealed what appeared to be a fire control system, unlike any Jack had seen before. Where did you get that? I know some guys at Aberdeen. This is an experimental gyro stabilizer. Makes firing on the move twice as accurate. Jack raised an eyebrow. Requisitioned through official channels? Rodriguez grinned. Let's just say it fell off a truck, Colonel. Jack should have reprimanded him. Instead, he simply asked, will it work? Better than anything the T-34 has. Install it, but keep it quiet. Throughout the facility, similar instances of creative acquisition were occurring. O'Neill had somehow obtained advanced optical sights. Washington had borrowed classified metallurgical reports on Soviet armor. These men were pulling every string, calling in every favor, reaching into the shadows of the military-industrial complex to give their tanks every possible advantage. 4 weeks into the project, they faced their first major crisis. The modified turret of the prototype Sherman cracked during test firing the massive recoil of the 90mm gun, proving too much for the original structure, even with reinforcement. Jack called an emergency meeting in the command center. Options, gentlemen? Washington spread out revised drawings. We can strengthen the turret further, but it adds weight. Too much weight. What about recoil dampeners, O'Neill suggested. Something to absorb more of the energy before it hits the mounting. Rodriguez shook his head. We've maxed out the hydraulic systems. They can't take any more pressure. The room fell silent, each man contemplating the setback. Then from the back, a quiet voice spoke up. What about the German documents? All eyes turned to Thompson, who rarely involved himself in the mechanical discussions. The medical officer has an idea about tank design, O'Neill said with a hint of sarcasm. Thompson ignored him, walking to the table where the captured German documents were stored. I was reviewing these for crew survival information, but there's something else here. He pulled out a schematic labeled Tiger Panzer in German script. The Germans solved this same problem. Their 88mm gun had massive recoil. They developed a dual-spring system with oil dampening that spread the force across the entire turret ring, not just the mounting points. Washington took the document, studying it intensely. This could work. We'd need to fabricate custom components, but the principle is sound. How long? Jack asked. 3 days to design, 1 week to fabricate and install. Jack nodded. Do it. The setback cost them precious time, but the solution proved elegant and effective. When they test-fired the modified Sherman with its new recoil system, the 90mm gun performed flawlessly, the entire vehicle absorbing the massive force without damage. As they approached the deadline for the first prototype's completion, a visitor arrived unannounced. Jack was supervising the installation of the final turret components when Rodriguez called up to him. "Colonel, there's someone here to see you. Says he's from Ordnance Department." Jack climbed down from the tank to find a civilian in a well-worn suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Colonel Thornton?" "Dr. Emil Schroeder." The German accent was unmistakable. Jack shook the offered hand cautiously. "What can I do for you, Dr. Schroeder?" "I believe I can be of assistance to your project, Colonel. I worked on Panzer development during the war. After Germany's surrender, I was brought to America as part of Operation Paperclip." Jack studied the man carefully. "And who sent you to us?" "General Davis suggested my expertise might be valuable. I specialize in armor composition and layout." The presence of a former enemy scientist raised eyebrows among the team, but Jack made the practical decision. Schroeder's knowledge could save lives, American lives. The past would have to remain in the past. Within days, Schroeder had made significant contributions, particularly to the armor configuration. His suggestions for overlapping plates at critical junctures improved protection without adding substantial weight. 5.5 weeks after the project began, the first prototype Sherman Gladiator, as the team had dubbed it, was ready for official testing. The tank barely resembled its original form. The hull featured angular armor extensions. The turret had been completely rebuilt to accommodate the massive 90mm gun. Even the suspension had been strengthened to handle the additional weight. The night before the official demonstration, Jack found O'Neill alone in the workshop making final adjustments to the fire control system. "Will it work, Frank?" Jack asked, the question that had haunted him for weeks. O'Neill didn't look up from his work. "The gun will punch through T-34 armor at 1,000 yards. The improved stabilizer gives us better accuracy than anything the North Koreans have. It'll work." "That's not what I'm asking." O'Neill stopped his calibrations, finally meeting Jack's gaze. "Will it save lives?" "Some. Is it enough?" "Never is in war." Jack nodded, accepting the brutal honesty. "You know Harrison will be looking for any flaw tomorrow, any excuse." "Let him look," O'Neill said, returning to his work. "This old dog still has teeth." The test range at Fort Belvoir had been prepared with targets at various ranges. Armor plates salvaged from destroyed vehicles simulated enemy tanks. A gallery of officers, including General Davis and the ever-present General Harrison, waited as the Sherman Gladiator rumbled onto the field. Jack had selected O'Neill to operate the main gun for the demonstration, with Rodriguez driving and Washington commanding. The tank looked fierce with its extended gun barrel and angular armor. It moved with surprising agility across the muddy terrain despite the added weight. "Gentlemen," Jack addressed the assembled officers, "what you are about to witness is the Sherman Gladiator, a rapid modification of existing M4A3E8 tanks to counter the Soviet T-34s in Korea. This vehicle features improved armor protection, enhanced firepower, and modernized targeting systems." He gestured toward the range. "The demonstration will include mobility tests, firing trials, and penetration tests against armor plate equivalent to the T-34. Harrison stepped forward. "Before we proceed, Colonel Thornton, I must register my official reservations. This project has proceeded without proper oversight, utilizing irregular procurement methods and retired personnel. I believe it represents a misallocation of resources." Davis intervened, his voice calm but authoritative. "Your objection is noted, General Harrison. Now let's see what Colonel Thornton and his team have accomplished." The demonstration began with the Sherman Gladiator executing mobility trials. Despite its increased weight, the tank maintained respectable speed and maneuverability. Next came firing trials, the massive 90mm gun thundering across the range, hitting targets with impressive accuracy. Finally came the crucial test. Armor penetration. Thick steel plates had been erected at various distances, each equivalent to the frontal armor of a T-34. The Sherman Gladiator took position at 800 yards from the first target. Inside the turret, O'Neill settled behind the gunner's sight, his experienced hands making minute adjustments. The targeting system Wrench had acquired gave him unprecedented stability even as the tank rocked slightly on its suspension. "On target!" O'Neill's voice came over the radio. "Fire when ready," Washington commanded. The 90mm gun roared, sending a specially designed armor-piercing round downrange. The shell struck the target dead center, punching through the armor plate with devastating effect. The observers murmured appreciatively. Even Harrison looked impressed despite himself. The tank moved to the next position farther from the target. Again, O'Neill found his mark. Again, the armor-piercing round penetrated cleanly. The final test came at 1,200 yards at the extreme edge of effective range. O'Neill took longer to set up the shot, calculating for wind and distance. "Send it," Washington ordered. The gun fired the recoil, rocking the tank backwards. Through binoculars, the observers watched the round strike slightly off-center but still penetrate the armor plate. As the Sherman Gladiator returned to the viewing area, smoke still curling from its barrel, Jack could see the expressions on the officers' faces: impressed, surprised, and in Harrison's case, calculating. "Questions, gentlemen," Jack invited as the tank crew dismounted. "Production timeline?" one colonel asked. "We can modify 30 tanks within 60 days, utilizing the facilities at Detroit Tank Arsenal. Each vehicle requires approximately 2,000 man-hours of work. Cost per unit? Approximately one-third the cost of a new M26 Pershing." The questions continued, focused on practical matters. Jack answered each precisely the weeks of intensive work, giving him complete command of the details. Finally, Harrison spoke. "An impressive demonstration, Colonel. However, I remain concerned about reliability under combat conditions. A single prototype performing well in controlled tests is hardly conclusive evidence of battlefield viability." Before Jack could respond, Davis interjected. "What would you suggest, General Harrison?" "A more rigorous testing protocol. Environmental trials, extended durability assessments. The normal procedure would be months of evaluation." "Months those boys in Korea don't have," Jack said quietly. The assembled officers fell silent, aware of the reports from the front lines. American tanks were being destroyed daily, their crews killed or captured. Davis surveyed the officers. "Gentlemen, I believe we've seen enough. Colonel Thornton's team has delivered a viable solution to an urgent tactical problem. I recommend immediate approval for limited production with concurrent field testing." Several officers nodded in agreement, but Harrison wasn't finished. "With all due respect, General, this is irregular. We have established protocols for weapons development for good reason." Davis faced Harrison directly. "These are irregular times, General. Our men are dying. Colonel Thornton and his team have given us a way to save American lives. I consider that worth bending a few protocols." Harrison's face flushed, but he said nothing more. The demonstration concluded with most officers congratulating Jack and his team. Only Harrison departed immediately, his aides hurrying to keep up. That evening, Jack received a telephone call in his office. It was Davis. "Production has been approved, Jack. 30 units to start. You did it." "Harrison?" "Overruled, but watch your back. He's not finished." Jack hung up the phone and walked to the workshop floor where his team waited. Their faces showed the exhaustion of weeks of nonstop work, but also pride in what they'd accomplished. "Well," Washington asked. "We're approved. 30 units. Detroit Arsenal will handle production with our team supervising." A cheer went up from the assembled men. They had pulled off what many considered impossible, creating a viable countermeasure to the T-34 in record time. As the celebration continued, Jack stepped outside into the cool evening air. Looking up at the stars, he thought about the young men fighting in Korea right now. Would the Sherman Gladiator reach them in time? Would it be enough to turn the tide? He didn't have those answers. But for the first time since returning from Europe, Jack felt he was doing something that mattered, something that might prevent other young men from dying in burning tanks far from home. The war he had walked away from had found him again, or perhaps he had never truly left it behind. As Jack stared into the darkness, a car approached the facility, its headlights cutting through the night. It stopped, and a messenger hurried toward him, carrying a sealed envelope. "Colonel Thornton, urgent message, sir." Jack opened the envelope, removing a single sheet of paper. As he read the brief message, his expression darkened, his hands clenched, crushing the paper. Inside the facility, the celebration continued, but Jack remained outside, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just learned. Their victory had been short-lived. General Harrison had outmaneuvered them. He'd convinced the Joint Chiefs to prioritize the accelerated delivery of M26 Pershings to Korea instead of investing in modified Shermans. Project Lazarus was to be temporarily suspended, pending further review. The Sherman Gladiator would never reach Korea, unless Jack could find a way to fight one more battle, not against foreign tanks, but against the bureaucracy of his own military. The silence in the workshop hung heavy as lead. Jack had gathered his core team in the command center the morning after receiving Harrison's directive. Their faces showed the brutal impact of the news. 5 weeks of back-breaking work, all for nothing. So that's it? Rodriguez slammed his fist on the table. Some pencil pusher decides our tanks aren't worth building and we just pack up and go home. Jack remained standing, his weathered face betraying no emotion, though inside he seethed with the same anger. Harrison convinced the Joint Chiefs that expediting the M26 Pershing is the better investment. On paper, he's right. The Pershing is the superior tank. Those boys in Korea will be dead before enough Pershings arrive. O'Neill's voice was quiet but edged with steel. Harrison knows that. He just doesn't care. Washington studied the production schedules spread across the table. We could have the first batch of Gladiators ready in 3 weeks. The Pershings will take months to reach the front in sufficient numbers. Thompson, who rarely spoke in these meetings, looked up from his notes. How many crews will die in the meantime? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Each man in the room had served in tanks during the war. Each understood the brutal mathematics of combat, the difference proper equipment made between life and death. Jack finally broke the silence. I've requested a meeting with General Davis. Until then, we continue working. On what authority? Washington asked. Mine. Jack's voice left no room for debate. The official order is for temporary suspension pending review. That gives us some wiggle room. The men exchanged glances. They were being asked to continue a project that might never see completion, risking their reputations and possibly more. I'm in. Rodriguez was the first to speak. Those kids need these tanks. O'Neill nodded his agreement. Thompson and Washington followed suit. What's the plan? Washington asked. Jack unrolled a fresh set of blueprints on the table. We focus on finishing one fully combat-ready tank. Something we can demonstrate that proves beyond doubt these modifications work under battlefield conditions. And if they still shut us down? Thompson asked the question they were all thinking. Jack's eyes hardened. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The team dispersed, returning to their work with renewed purpose. Jack remained in the command center studying the technical drawings. The Sherman Gladiator wasn't just a mechanical project anymore. It had become something more, a testament to what these forgotten veterans could still contribute. The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Thornton. Jack, it's Davis. I've been trying to reach you. What's the situation, Max? Davis sighed heavily, the sound crackling through the line. Harrison has the Joint Chiefs convinced. They're not budging on the suspension order. We need these tanks in Korea now, not 3 months from now. I know that, Jack, but my hands are tied officially. Jack caught the emphasis on the last word. And unofficially, a long pause followed. There's a transport ship leaving for Busan in 2 weeks. The Benevolence. If a tank or two happened to be aboard, no one would notice until it was too late. You're suggesting we go around the Joint Chiefs? I'm not suggesting anything, Colonel. Davis's voice turned formal. Merely informing you of naval logistics. I have to go. Watch yourself, Jack. The line went dead, leaving Jack holding the receiver, his mind racing. Davis had just offered a dangerous lifeline. If they could get even one Sherman Gladiator to Korea and prove its effectiveness in combat, the program might be salvaged. But the risks were enormous. Career ending at minimum court-martial at worst. Jack left the command center and walked through the workshop. The team had continued working despite the suspension order, the prototype Sherman Gladiator, now nearly complete. Rodriguez was underneath the hull making final adjustments to the transmission, while O'Neill calibrated the main gun's elevation mechanism. These men had given everything to this project, believing they could make a difference. Jack couldn't let it end now, not when they were so close. He retreated to his office, closing the door before making a series of telephone calls to contacts throughout the military logistics chain. By evening, he had confirmed what Davis had told him. The USS Benevolence would depart from Oakland in 12 days, bound for Busan with a cargo of medical supplies, vehicles, and replacement parts. One more call delivered the most crucial piece of information. The ship's manifest was being prepared by a Lieutenant Wilson, a young officer who had served under Jack in the final months of World War II. The connection was tenuous, but it might be enough. Jack was about to leave when there was a knock at his door. He quickly covered the notes he'd been making. Come in! The door opened, revealing Dr. Schroeder, the German scientist. Colonel, I hope I am not interrupting. What do you need, Doctor? Schroeder closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. I understand the project has been suspended. News travels fast. Indeed, Schroeder nodded. I also understand you may be contemplating alternative methods of deployment. Jack's expression remained neutral. I don't know what you mean. The German smiled thinly. Colonel, please. I worked under Albert Speer. I recognize the signs of, how do you say, irregular procurement methods. Jack stood up immediately defensive. Dr. Schroeder, whatever you think you know. Schroeder raised his hands. I am not here to threaten or expose, Colonel. I am here to help. Why would you help bypass American military command? Schroeder's face grew serious. During the war, I designed armor for tanks that killed Allied soldiers. Many Allied soldiers. I cannot undo this, but perhaps I can save some American lives now. Balance the scales in some small way. Jack studied the man carefully, looking for any sign of deception. He saw only sincerity. What are you offering? I have made an improvement to the frontal armor design, a modification of the glacis plate angle that increases effective thickness without adding weight. It would make the Sherman Gladiator even more resistant to Soviet 85mm shells. Schroeder placed technical drawings on Jack's desk. The design was elegant, a simple modification that could significantly improve crew survival. How quickly can this be implemented? 2 days. I have already prepared the specifications. Jack made his decision. Do it, but keep this between us for now. After Schroeder left, Jack sat in silence, contemplating the risks he was taking. Going against direct orders from the Joint Chiefs could end with all of them in prison. But the alternative was to sit back and watch as more young Americans died needlessly. The next morning, Jack called his core team together away from the main workshop in a small storage room where they could speak privately. I have a proposal. Jack began without preamble. It's not strictly by the book, and anyone who wants to walk away can do so now, no questions asked. No one moved. We're going to complete one Sherman Gladiator to full combat readiness. Then we're going to make sure it gets to Korea on the USS Benevolence. Washington whistled low. That's court-martial territory, Jack. I know. That's why this has to be voluntary. I'll take full responsibility if it comes to that. O'Neill laughed humorlessly. What are they going to do to us? Take away our pensions? Send us to the front? I've got one foot in the grave already. Might as well make it count for something. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. I'm in, Colonel. Those boys need our tank. Thompson looked troubled. The legal ramifications aside, can one tank really make a difference? If it performs in combat, if it saves lives and destroys enemy tanks, it creates a compelling case for the whole program. Jack spread his hands. One tank in the field is worth more than 30 on paper. Washington considered for a long moment. This could end badly for all of us. It could, Jack acknowledged. When do we start? Jack smiled for the first time. We already have. The work accelerated with the team now focused on a single objective, getting one perfect Sherman Gladiator ready for covert deployment. Schroeder's armor modifications were integrated into the design, with Rodriguez supervising the welding crews as they reworked the frontal glacis plates to the new specifications. Jack spent his days coordinating the technical aspects and his nights planning the logistics of getting the tank to Oakland and onto the Benevolence without raising alarms. The task seemed nearly impossible. A 35-ton vehicle couldn't simply be smuggled aboard a ship. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. While reviewing transportation options, Jack discovered that several M24 Chaffee tanks were already scheduled for loading onto the Benevolence as replacement vehicles for units in Korea. If they could get the Sherman Gladiator included in that shipment, properly documented as an M24 variant, it might pass cursory inspection. Jack placed a call to Lieutenant Wilson, the young officer handling the ship's manifest. Their conversation was necessarily oblique, with Jack referring to special testing equipment that needed to reach Korea on an accelerated timeline. Whether Wilson understood the true nature of the request remained unclear, but he agreed to add an entry to the manifest for modified M24 test platform XM1. With the paperwork angle covered, Jack turned to the physical challenges. The Sherman Gladiator would need to be transported from Fort Belvoir to Oakland, nearly 3,000 miles across the country. Such movements typically required extensive documentation and approval, especially for experimental military vehicles. The solution came from Washington, who had maintained connections with his former employer, the automobile factory in Detroit. We can transport it as an industrial prototype, Washington explained. The factory regularly moves experimental vehicles across the country under tarps on commercial transporters. With the right paperwork, no one looks too closely. Can you arrange it? Washington nodded. I know people who owe me favors, big ones. The tank itself was coming together beautifully. With Schroeder's armor modifications integrated, the frontal protection now approached that of much heavier tanks. O'Neill had perfected the fire control system, improving accuracy by nearly 30% in trials. Rodriguez had somehow acquired a more powerful engine, increasing the power-to-weight ratio despite the added armor. 8 days before the Benevolence was scheduled to depart, Jack received word that transport from Fort Belvoir to Oakland had been arranged. A commercial vehicle transporter would arrive the following night. The team worked through the night preparing the Sherman Gladiator for movement. The 90mm gun was secured in travel position. External equipment was properly stowed. Fresh paint covered the vehicle with appropriate markings to pass casual inspection as a standard Army test vehicle. Just before dawn, the massive transport truck arrived backing into the loading area of the workshop. The driver, a burly man with a thick beard, exchanged a few quiet words with Washington before helping the team secure the tank to the trailer. As the sun began to rise, the Sherman Gladiator rolled out of Fort Belvoir, concealed under heavy canvas covers, its true nature hidden from casual observation. Jack watched it leave, knowing he had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The remainder of the team would follow separately to Oakland to oversee the loading process. Jack stayed behind to maintain appearances and manage any inquiries about the missing prototype. He had just settled into his office to prepare cover stories when his telephone rang. Thornton. Colonel, this is Captain Reynolds, Front Gate Security. General Harrison is here requesting access to the facility. He says it's for an unscheduled inspection. Jack's blood ran cold. Harrison arriving unannounced the morning after they'd moved the tank could not be coincidence. Thank you, Captain. Please escort the General to my office. Jack quickly made a series of calls, warning the team already en route. Then he gathered the remaining personnel, briefing them on what to say about the missing prototype. The official story would be that it had been moved to Aberdeen Proving Ground for additional testing, a plausible explanation that would buy them time. General Harrison arrived 15 minutes later, his uniform immaculate, his face set in lines of suspicion. 2 military police officers accompanied him. Colonel Thornton, Harrison didn't bother with pleasantries. I understand you have continued work on the Sherman modification project despite the suspension order. Jack stood at ease, his posture relaxed, belying the tension he felt. We've been organizing documentation and securing equipment, General. Standard procedure when a project changes status. Harrison's eyes narrowed. I'd like to see the prototype vehicle. I'm afraid that's not possible, sir. The prototype has been transferred to Aberdeen for comprehensive testing per Army Ordnance protocols. Interesting. I spoke with Colonel Benson at Aberdeen this morning. He mentioned no such transfer. Jack maintained his composure. The paperwork was just processed yesterday, General. I'm sure Colonel Benson will be notified through proper channels shortly. Harrison stepped closer, his voice dropping. I know what you're doing, Thornton. You think you can circumvent the chain of command, force the issue by presenting the Joint Chiefs with a fait accompli. It won't work. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. Harrison turned to the MPs. Search the facility. I want to see every piece of documentation related to the current whereabouts of the prototype vehicle. For the next 3 hours, Harrison's men tore through the workshop and offices searching for evidence. They found nothing conclusive. Jack had been careful to remove or alter any documentation that might reveal the true destination of the Sherman Gladiator. Finally, Harrison confronted Jack again in the command center, his frustration evident. Where is the tank, Colonel? And don't insult my intelligence with more stories about Aberdeen. Jack met his gaze steadily. With all due respect, General, I've told you everything I can about the project's status. Harrison's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, Thornton. Not by a long shot. When I find proof of what you've done, I'll have you court-martialed. You and every man involved in this little conspiracy. After Harrison departed, Jack received a telephone call from Washington, now halfway across the country with the tank. We may have a problem, Jack. Harrison showed up here asking questions. I know, he just left. How's our package? Secure for now. We're changing routes just in case. Taking secondary roads will slow us down, but it's safer. Good thinking. Keep moving. I'll handle things here. Jack spent the next 2 days creating an elaborate paper trail, suggesting the prototype had indeed been transferred to Aberdeen while simultaneously removing any evidence of their actual plan. He worked tirelessly knowing that Harrison would be watching his every move. On the 3rd day, General Davis arrived at the facility. Jack welcomed him to the command center, aware that their conversation might be monitored. General Davis, this is an unexpected pleasure. Davis nodded, understanding the need for discretion. Just checking on the status of the project, Colonel. I understand there's been some confusion about the prototype's whereabouts. Yes, sir. General Harrison seemed quite concerned. Davis lowered his voice. Walk with me, Colonel. They left the building, strolling across the grounds of Fort Belvoir, away from potential listening devices. Harrison has launched an official investigation, Davis said once they were alone. He's convinced you've gone rogue with the prototype. And what do you think, General? Davis smiled thinly. I think the prototype is undergoing specialized testing at a secure location. That's the official position I'm taking. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Harrison has a lot of influence. If he finds proof of what you're really doing, not even I can protect you. Jack nodded, understanding the risk. Some things are worth the cost, General. Just make sure it works, Jack. Make sure it was worth it. Later that day, Jack received word from Washington. The Sherman Gladiator had arrived in Oakland and was being prepared for loading onto the Benevolence. The critical phase of their plan was about to begin. Jack arranged for emergency leave, citing a family situation. Within hours, he was on a military transport flight to California. If their plan was going to succeed, he needed to be there in person to oversee the final stage. Oakland Naval Base sprawled along the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, a hub of activity as America funneled men and equipment to the Korean conflict. Jack arrived wearing civilian clothes, his military ID, identifying him as a technical advisor rather than a full colonel to avoid unwanted attention. He found Washington at a small motel near the base. Status? Washington looked exhausted but determined. The tank arrived last night. We've stored it at a commercial warehouse 2 miles from the base. Rodriguez and O'Neill are with it now, making final preparations. And the Benevolence? Docked at Pier 7. Loading begins tomorrow at 0600. Lieutenant Wilson has confirmed our paperwork is in order. The tank is scheduled for loading at 0930. Jack nodded. We'll need transportation from the warehouse to the pier capable of handling a 35-ton vehicle. Already arranged. Commercial heavy equipment transporter will arrive at 0500. Harrison? Washington grimaced. No sign of him, but we've heard rumors that MPs have been asking questions around the base. He may have people watching the Benevolence. Then we'll need to be especially careful. Where's Thompson? At the base hospital. He arranged temporary privileges as a visiting physician. He's been scouting the loading procedures, studying the security patterns. Jack smiled appreciatively. His team continued to show initiative beyond expectations. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be the moment of truth. Dawn broke over Oakland Harbor, painting the water in hues of gold and crimson as Jack arrived at the commercial warehouse. The massive door rolled up, revealing the Sherman Gladiator, looking formidable even at rest. Rodriguez was already checking the engine while O'Neill made final adjustments to the gun stabilizer, secured in travel position. She's ready, Colonel. Rodriguez wiped grease from his hands. Fresh fluids topped off, tracks tensioned. She'll make the journey. Jack walked around the vehicle, inspecting it carefully. They had done remarkable work. Despite the added armor and larger gun, the tank maintained the recognizable profile of an American medium tank. The olive drab paint job, complete with the appropriate Army identification numbers, would help it blend in with other vehicles being loaded. At precisely 0500, the heavy equipment transporter arrived backing into the warehouse. With practiced efficiency, the team secured the Sherman Gladiator into the trailer, concealing the most distinctive features under canvas covers. By 0545, they were on the road to Oakland Naval Base. Jack rode in the lead vehicle with Washington while Rodriguez and O'Neill followed in separate cars. Thompson would meet them at the pier. As they approached the main gate, Jack felt the tension building. This was the first major checkpoint. If their paperwork didn't hold up, the entire operation would collapse. The gate guard examined their documentation carefully. Purpose of visit? Delivery of test equipment for shipment to Korea. Jack handed over the specially prepared orders. The guard studied the papers, then looked at the covered vehicle on the trailer. What type of equipment is that? Modified M24 test platform, Jack replied smoothly. Experimental version for field trials. After a moment, the guard nodded, waving them through. Jack released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. First hurdle cleared. They proceeded to Pier 7, where the USS Benevolence was being loaded. The massive transport ship loomed over the dock cranes, moving steadily as they transferred equipment from the pier to the ship's holds. Dozens of vehicles were lined up waiting for loading, mostly jeeps, trucks, and a few light tanks. Thompson met them at the staging area dressed in an Army medical officer's uniform. Loading of vehicles is proceeding on schedule. The M24s are over there. He pointed to a row of light tanks waiting their turn. Any problems? Jack asked. Nothing so far, but there's an officer checking documentation more thoroughly than usual. Could be one of Harrison's people. Jack nodded. We stick to the plan. The paperwork should hold up to scrutiny. They maneuvered the transport into position near the other M24 chaffies. Once in line, they removed the canvas covers, revealing the Sherman Gladiator in all its modified glory. To a casual observer, it might appear to be just another Army tank, But anyone with knowledge of armor would immediately notice the differences: the larger gun, the modified turret, the angled armor plates. Now we wait, Jack said. The minutes stretched into hours as the loading process continued. Each vehicle was checked, inspected, and documented before being driven onto the ship. As the Sherman Gladiator moved closer to the front of the line, Jack spotted a military police officer examining paperwork with unusual attention. Thompson, Jack nodded toward the MP. That's our potential problem. Thompson observed the officer for a moment. Leave it to me. He approached the MP, engaged him in conversation, then led him away from the loading area toward the base hospital, apparently discussing some urgent medical matter. Jack silently thanked Thompson's quick thinking, one obstacle temporarily removed. Finally, it was their turn. The loading officer approached, clipboard in hand. Vehicle designation? Modified M24 test platform XM1. Jack handed over the paperwork Lieutenant Wilson had prepared. The officer frowned, studying the documents. This doesn't match the standard configuration for an M24. Jack nodded professionally. It's an experimental variant, sir. Enhanced armament for field testing and combat conditions. The paperwork should indicate special handling instructions. The officer flipped through the pages, finding the orders signed by General Davis authorizing the shipment. He seemed satisfied until he walked around to the front of the tank, noticing the significantly larger gun and modified turret. This looks more like a Sherman than a Chaffee. Jack maintained his composure. It incorporates elements from both platforms, sir. Hence the modified designation. The officer seemed skeptical. I should verify this with command. Of course, sir. Though I should mention the shipment has priority clearance from General Davis himself. Any delay would require explanation directly to him. The implicit threat worked. The officer looked at the paperwork again, seeing Davis's signature. Very well. Proceed to loading position Alpha. Next vehicle. Rodriguez climbed into the driver's seat, starting the powerful engine. The Sherman Gladiator rumbled to life, moving forward toward the loading ramp of the Benevolence. Jack, Washington, O'Neill, and Thompson watched anxiously as their creation, the product of weeks of extraordinary effort, crawled up the ramp and disappeared into the cavernous hold of the ship. We did it, Washington said quietly. She's on her way to Korea. Jack nodded. Now comes the hard part, making sure she gets used properly when she arrives. The team gathered at a small cafe near the waterfront to celebrate their success. The mood was triumphant but subdued, each man aware of the risks they had taken and the potential consequences still to come. What happens now? Thompson asked the question on everyone's mind. Jack sipped his coffee, considering. The Benevolence reaches Pusan in 18 days. Someone needs to be there to make sure the Sherman Gladiator gets into the right hands. Someone who understands its capabilities and can train a crew. You're going to Korea. It wasn't a question. Washington knew Jack too well. I've arranged passage on a military transport flight leaving tomorrow. With luck, I'll arrive before the Benevolence. O'Neill leaned forward. Not alone you're not. I'm coming too. Frank, save it, Jack. You'll need someone who knows that fire control system inside and out. Besides, who else is going to shoot that 90mm gun properly? Jack knew better than to argue. O'Neill was right. They needed an expert gunner to demonstrate the tank's capabilities. Anyone else? Jack looked at the others. Rodriguez raised his hand. Someone has to keep that engine running. Count me in. Washington and Thompson exchanged glances. I can't, Washington said regretfully. My wife's health. I understand, Sam. You've done more than enough. Thompson considered for a long moment. I should stay as well. I can monitor the situation here, manage any fallout from Harrison's investigation. Jack nodded, grateful. We'll need someone watching our backs stateside. As they finished their coffee, Jack noticed two military police officers enter the cafe, scanning the customers. He tensed, immediately recognizing one as the officer Thompson had diverted earlier. Company, he murmured. Back door, casual pace. The team rose smoothly, leaving payment on the table and moving unhurriedly toward the rear exit. They made it outside and were walking toward their vehicles when a voice called out, Colonel Thornton! Jack turned to see the MPs approaching rapidly. He motioned for the others to continue walking. Can I help you, gentlemen? Sir, we have orders to escort you to base headquarters for questioning regarding the unauthorized transfer of military equipment. Harrison had moved faster than expected. Jack maintained his composure, calculating options. What equipment would that be, officer? A modified tank, sir, loaded onto the USS Benevolence approximately 1 hour ago. Jack feigned confusion. I'm afraid there must be some mistake. I'm here as a technical advisor overseeing the shipment of approved test equipment. The MP produced a document. Sir, we have orders signed by General Harrison to detain you pending investigation. Jack studied the paper, noting with professional interest that it was a detention order, not an arrest warrant. Harrison was overreaching his authority. Very well, I'll accompany you to headquarters, but I must insist on speaking with General Davis immediately. The MPs escorted Jack to a waiting jeep. As they drove away, he saw Rodriguez, O'Neill, and the others watching from a distance. They would understand what to do. The plan had anticipated this possibility. At base headquarters, Jack was led to a small conference room and left under guard. An hour passed before the door opened, revealing General Harrison, his face flushed with triumph. Colonel Thornton, I believe we have some matters to discuss. Jack remained seated, his posture relaxed. General Harrison, I wasn't aware you had authority in this command sector. Harrison placed a folder on the table. I have authority to investigate the misappropriation of Army property, specifically one modified Sherman tank that somehow found its way onto a transport ship bound for Korea, despite explicit orders to the contrary. I'm not sure what you're referring to, General. Harrison's smile was cold. Let's not play games, Colonel. I know you arranged for the prototype to be transported across the country. I know you falsified documentation to get it loaded onto the Benevolence. And I know you intended to accompany it to Korea to demonstrate its capabilities outside proper channels. Jack said nothing. What I don't know, Harrison continued, is why a decorated officer would risk his career, even prison, to defy direct orders from the Joint Chiefs. Jack met Harrison's gaze directly. Because some things matter more than careers or regulations, General. Because sometimes the system fails the men on the front lines. How very noble. Harrison's voice dripped sarcasm, and completely irrelevant. I've already contacted the ship's captain. The tank will be offloaded before departure. Your little scheme has failed, Colonel. Jack felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. If the Sherman Gladiator was removed from the Benevolence, everything they had worked for would be lost. The Joint Chiefs made their decision, Colonel. Harrison continued, the M-26 Pershing is the future of American armor. Your modified Sherman is a distraction, a waste of resources. The Pershing is an excellent tank, Jack agreed, but it won't be available in sufficient numbers for months. How many crews will die in the meantime, General? How many young men will burn in outclassed vehicles while waiting for the perfect solution? Harrison's expression hardened. That's not your concern, Colonel. Your concern right now is the charges you're facing. Misappropriation of military property, falsifying official documents, insubordination. Your military career is over. You'll be fortunate to avoid prison. The door opened and an aide entered, whispering something to Harrison. The general's triumphant expression faltered, replaced by confusion. What do you mean they can't find it? Harrison demanded. Jack suppressed a smile. His team had moved quickly, just as planned. If the Sherman Gladiator couldn't be located, it couldn't be removed from the ship. And a single tank hidden among hundreds of vehicles in the cavernous hold of a transport ship could prove remarkably difficult to find, especially if someone had deliberately obscured its identification markings after loading. Harrison turned back to Jack, suspicion in his eyes. What have you done? I'm sitting right here, General. Under your guard, how could I have done anything? Harrison stormed out, barking orders to his aides. Jack remained in the conference room, now guarded by a single MP. Hours passed. Eventually, the door opened again, revealing not Harrison but General Davis. You're in a world of trouble, Jack. Davis dismissed the guard, closing the door behind him. What's the situation, Max? Davis sighed heavily. Harrison has the base on alert. They've been searching the Benevolence for the tank, but apparently they can't locate it. Loading is complete. The ship is scheduled to depart in 3 hours. And my status? Technically, you're being detained pending investigation. But Harrison is overstepping his authority. He needs formal charges approved by JAG Corps before he can actually arrest you. Jack nodded, processing the information. Can you get me out of here? Davis considered for a moment. I can transfer you to my custody claim. It's a matter pertaining to my command. It would buy us some time. Do it. Within an hour, Jack had been released to Davis's custody. They left the headquarters building together, walking toward Davis's staff car. Your men moved quickly, Davis commented. The tank seems to have vanished. Rodriguez is very resourceful. Probably repainted the identification numbers hidden among other vehicles. Harrison is furious. He's convinced this is part of some elaborate conspiracy. Jack smiled slightly. Isn't it? The ship sails in 2 hours. Harrison's people are still searching, but time is running out. And afterward? Davis's expression grew serious. Harrison won't give up Jack. He'll push for court-martial. I can slow the process, but eventually you'll have to answer for this. By then, the Sherman Gladiator will have proven itself in combat. The whole equation changes. Let's hope so. For now, we need to get you out of sight until the benevolence departs. Davis drove Jack to a small administrative building on the edge of the base. Inside, Rodriguez and O'Neill waited relieved to see their commander. "Colonel," Rodriguez grinned, "glad to see you made it out." "Status of our package?" Jack asked immediately. "Secure. We removed the original markings, replaced them with standard M4A3E8 identification. Covered the main modifications with tarps. She's now just another Sherman in the cargo hold." "Excellent work. The ship sails in 2 hours." O'Neill looked concerned. "What about our passage to Korea? Harrison will be watching the transport flights." Jack turned to Davis. "Can you help with that, General?" Davis nodded. "I can arrange priority transport through naval channels. Air Force flight leaving from Alameda tomorrow. Harrison has no authority over Navy operations." "That will work. Thank you, Max." Davis headed for the door, pausing before he left. "Jack, be careful in Korea. It's a real war zone, not a testing ground." "I know, Max. We'll be careful." After Davis departed, Jack briefed Rodriguez and O'Neill on the next phase of their plan. They would lie low until the Benevolence sailed, then proceed to Alameda Naval Air Station for transport to Japan and onward to Korea. "What about Harrison?" O'Neill asked. "He'll try to radio ahead, have the tank impounded when it reaches Pusan." Jack smiled. "Already addressed. Lieutenant Wilson has modified the cargo manifest. Our tank is now listed as Equipment Consignment 447 without specific designation. By the time anyone in Pusan figures out what it is, we'll be there to take charge." As evening fell, they received word from Thompson. The USS Benevolence had departed Oakland Harbor on schedule bound for Korea. The Sherman Gladiator was officially beyond Harrison's reach. The three men shared a quiet celebration that night, knowing that the most dangerous phase of their mission still lay ahead. They had succeeded in getting the tank to Korea, but now they would have to prove its worth in actual combat against the very real threat of Soviet T-34s. The following morning, they traveled discreetly to Alameda Naval Air Station, boarding a military transport flight to Japan. Harrison's influence apparently didn't extend to naval operations, as they encountered no resistance. 20 hours later, they landed at Yokota Air Base outside Tokyo for refueling before continuing to Korea. While waiting for their connecting flight, Jack placed a call to an old friend, Colonel David Mitchell, now serving as operations officer with the 1st Marine Division in Korea. Their conversation was necessarily oblique, with Jack referring to special equipment arriving on the Benevolence and requesting Mitchell's assistance in directing it to a unit that could make proper use of it. Mitchell seemed to understand, reading between the lines of Jack's careful phrasing. He agreed to meet them in Pusan when they arrived. 2 days later, their transport touched down at an airfield near Pusan, the main port and logistics hub for UN forces in Korea. The contrast with California was stark. Here, the war felt immediate real. Military vehicles clogged the roads. The distant thump of artillery could be heard even from the airfield. Wounded soldiers were being loaded onto the same transport that had brought them the aircraft returning to Japan with its cargo of broken young men. Colonel Mitchell met them at the airfield, a jeep waiting to take them to his headquarters. He was younger than Jack, but his face showed the strain of months of brutal combat. "Jack, it's been a long time." They shook hands warmly. "Your message intrigued me. Special equipment?" "David, we need to talk somewhere private." Mitchell nodded, understanding. "My quarters. We can speak freely there." At Mitchell's Spartan quarters, Jack explained the entire situation, the Sherman Gladiator, its capabilities, the circumstances of its development, and the opposition from General Harrison. He held nothing back, knowing that Mitchell's support would be crucial. When he finished, Mitchell whistled low. "You risked court-martial to get this tank to Korea. Must be something special." "It is. Improved armor, enhanced firepower, better targeting systems. It can take on a T-34 on equal terms, something the M24s can't do." Mitchell considered for a moment. "The Benevolence docks tomorrow. Assuming we can locate your tank, what then?" "We need a combat unit willing to field test it, preferably one engaged with enemy armor." "I know just the outfit, Baker Company 8th Tank Battalion. They've been hit hard operating M24s against T-34s. Lost 4 tanks last week alone. Their commander, Captain Reynolds, is desperate for better equipment." Jack nodded. "Perfect. Can you arrange a meeting?" "I'll do better than that. I'll have him meet us at the dock tomorrow when your tank arrives." The following day, they watched from the pier as the USS Benevolence docked at Pusan Harbor. The massive vessel was quickly swarmed by stevedores and military personnel, beginning the complex process of unloading vital war material. Jack, Rodriguez, and O'Neill waited anxiously with Colonel Mitchell and Captain Reynolds, a young officer whose haunted eyes spoke of too much combat in too short a time. Jack had briefly explained their mission to Reynolds, who had responded with cautious optimism. If this modified Sherman can really handle a T-34 Colonel, it would be a godsend, Reynolds had said. My men are sitting ducks in those chaffies. 4 hours into the unloading process, Jack spotted what they were waiting for. A Sherman tank was being offloaded from the ship's hold. Even from a distance, he could recognize the distinctive profile of the Gladiator, despite the attempts to disguise it. There she is, Jack pointed. They approached as the tank was lowered to the dock. Up close, the modifications were obvious. The extended gun barrel, the reinforced turret, the angled armor plates. Rodriguez immediately circled the vehicle, checking for any damage during transport, while O'Neill climbed up to inspect the main gun. She looks good, Colonel, Rodriguez called down. No damage that I can see. Captain Reynolds studied the tank with professional interest. That's a 90mm gun, isn't it? Same as the Pershing. Yes, but in a more mobile platform, Jack explained. The Sherman Gladiator combines the Pershing's firepower with the Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance. Impressive. When can we test it? Right now, if you have a suitable location. Reynolds smiled. I know just the place, a firing range outside Pusan. We can put her through her paces, see what she can really do. They arranged for the Sherman Gladiator to be transported to the range. By late afternoon, they were ready for the demonstration. Rodriguez at the controls, O'Neill in the gunner's position. Jack stood with Reynolds, Mitchell, and several of Reynolds' officers as the tank maneuvered across the rough terrain. Notice the improved suspension, Jack pointed out. Better cross-country mobility than the standard Sherman. The tank took firing position, aiming at targets set up to simulate T-34s at various ranges. O'Neill's first shot thundered across the range, the 90mm shell, striking the target dead center with devastating effect. Direct hit, Reynolds exclaimed, at 900 yards. O'Neill continued the demonstration, landing shot after shot on target, even when the tank was moving. The improved stabilization system proved its worth, allowing accuracy that impressed even the skeptical tank officers. After an hour of demonstrations, Reynolds was convinced. Colonel Thornton, this is exactly what we need. When can my men start training on it? Immediately. Sergeant Rodriguez and Sergeant O'Neill will stay with the tank, provide full technical briefing and operational training. And you, Colonel? Jack hesitated. His mission was technically complete. He had delivered the Sherman Gladiator to Korea, put it in the hands of a combat unit that would use it effectively. He could return to the States, report the success to Davis, face whatever consequences awaited him. But looking at Reynolds and his men, their expressions a mixture of hope and desperation, Jack knew he couldn't leave yet. Not until he had seen the Gladiator in actual combat, proven beyond doubt that their creation could save lives. I'll stay until your crews are fully trained, Captain. I want to see this through. For the next 3 days, Jack supervised intensive training for Reynolds' tank crews. The Sherman Gladiator proved remarkably adaptable, with drivers and gunners quickly mastering its unique characteristics. O'Neill worked closely with the gunners, teaching them the subtleties of the improved fire control system, while Rodriguez instructed the maintenance crews on the engine modifications and reinforced suspension. On the 4th day, Colonel Mitchell arrived at their training area with urgent news. North Korean forces had launched a new offensive, pushing south toward their position. Enemy armor, including at least a company of T-34s, was reported moving toward a strategic crossroads 15 miles north. Baker Company is being deployed to block the advance, Mitchell informed them. Reynolds wants to take the Gladiator into combat. Jack felt a surge of both anticipation and anxiety. This was what they had worked for, the moment of truth when their creation would face the enemy. Is the crew ready? Mitchell nodded. Reynolds has his best men assigned to it. They've trained hard these past few days. We're going with them. Jack's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Mitchell looked like he might object, then thought better of it. Technically, you're all still consultants attached to my command. I can authorize it. That evening, they joined Baker Company as they prepared to move out. The Sherman Gladiator had been given a fresh coat of olive drab paint with appropriate unit markings. It looked formidable among the smaller M24 chaffies that made up the rest of the company. Captain Reynolds briefed his officers, Jack sitting in as technical advisor. The mission was straightforward. Baker Company would establish defensive positions along a ridgeline overlooking the crossroads. Their job was to delay the North Korean advance long enough for infantry reinforcements to arrive and establish a proper defensive line. The Gladiator will take center position, Reynolds explained. Maximum fields of fire covering the main approach. The chaffies will provide flank security and engage lighter vehicles. After the briefing, Jack found Rodriguez and O'Neill checking the Gladiator one last time. "She's ready, Colonel." Rodriguez patted the hull affectionately. "Everything's in perfect working order." O'Neill looked up from adjusting the gun elevation mechanism. "I've worked with the gunner, Corporal Harris. Kid's a natural. He'll hit what he aims at." Jack nodded appreciatively. "Good work, both of you. Tomorrow we find out if all our efforts were worth it." As dawn broke the next morning, Baker Company moved out the rumble of engines, breaking the pre-dawn stillness. Jack rode in a Jeep with Reynolds while Rodriguez and O'Neill accompanied the Gladiator, offering last-minute advice to its crew. They reached the designated ridgeline by mid-morning, establishing their positions with the practiced efficiency of veterans. The Sherman Gladiator took its place at the center of the line, partially concealed behind an earthen berm, with excellent fields of fire across the valley below. Jack joined Reynolds in a forward observation post, scanning the northern approaches with binoculars. For several hours, nothing moved on the road leading to the crossroads. Then shortly after noon, the first signs of the enemy appeared. "Contact front," Reynolds spoke calmly into his radio. "Enemy armor approaching from the north. Multiple T-34s with infantry support." Through his binoculars, Jack counted 8 T-34-85 tanks, leading a column of trucks and troops. The Soviet-built tanks moved with confidence down the road, their commanders apparently unaware of the American positions on the ridge. "Range 2,000 yards into closing," Reynolds updated his gunners. "Hold fire until my command." Jack watched tensely as the North Korean forces advanced. The T-34s were formidable opponents, their 85mm guns capable of destroying any American tank in Korea. But now they faced something new, something specifically designed to counter their advantages. "All tanks hold fire until 1,000 yards, Reynolds ordered. "Let them commit to the crossroads." The North Korean column continued its advance, the T-34s spreading out as they approached the crossroads. At 1,200 yards, they halted briefly, their commanders conferring, while infantry began to dismount from the trucks. "They're deploying," Reynolds observed, "preparing to secure the area." Jack watched as the enemy tanks resumed their advance, now moving more cautiously. When they reached approximately 1,000 yards from the American positions, Reynolds gave the order. "All tanks engage targets of opportunity. Gladiator, take the lead, T-3." The ridge erupted with gunfire as Baker Company opened up. The Chaffees targeted the trucks and lighter vehicles, their 75mm guns ineffective against the frontal armor of the T-34s. The Sherman Gladiator fired its first combat shot, the 90mm gun thundering across the valley. Jack watched through binoculars as the round struck the lead T-34 squarely on the turret. Unlike what would have happened with a standard Sherman's 76mm gun, this round penetrated the Soviet armor completely. The T-34 shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from the hatches. "Direct hit," Reynolds exclaimed. "Target destroyed." The Gladiator shifted aim, firing again. Another T-34 took a hit, this time in the hull. Its ammunition exploded in a catastrophic detonation that lifted the turret completely off the hull. The North Korean force responded with determination, the remaining T-34s returning fire as they maneuvered to engage the American position. Their 85mm shells struck near the Gladiator, throwing earth and debris into the air, but failing to score a direct hit. For 20 minutes, the battle raged. The Gladiator destroyed 2 more T-34s while the Chaffees engaged the infantry and support vehicles. Then a North Korean tank managed to flank the American position, bringing its gun to bear on one of the Chaffees. The American light tank exploded, its crew having no chance to escape. Reynolds ordered a fighting withdrawal, pulling his forces back to secondary positions. The Gladiator provided covering fire, its 90mm gun, keeping the North Korean tanks at bay as the Chaffees retreated. In its new position, the Gladiator found itself directly challenged by 2 T-34s advancing side by side. Both enemy tanks fired almost simultaneously, their shells narrowly missing their target. The Gladiator returned fire, destroying 1 T-34 with a shot through the driver's viewport. The second enemy tank closed the distance to 400 yards, then fired again. This time, its shell struck the Gladiator directly on its modified frontal armor. Jack held his breath, watching for the result. This was the ultimate test of Schroeder's armor design. The shell failed to penetrate the angled plates, instead ricocheting off with a shower of sparks. The Gladiator responded immediately, its 90mm gun finding the T-34's turret ring. The Soviet tank ground to a halt, its turret jammed, unable to traverse. A second shot from the Gladiator finished it. By late afternoon, the battle was over. The North Korean force had been repulsed, losing 6 T-34s and numerous support vehicles. Baker Company had lost 2 Chaffees, but the Sherman Gladiator remained operational, having proven its worth beyond any doubt. Jack approached the Gladiator as its crew emerged triumphant from the hatches. The young men were grinning with a special exhilaration that comes from surviving combat. 4 confirmed kills, sir, the tank commander reported proudly. And we took a direct hit without penetration. Jack inspected the impact point on the frontal armor. The shell had left a deep gouge, but the angled plates had performed exactly as Schroeder had predicted, dispersing the energy of the impact. Rodriguez climbed up, examining the damage with professional interest. Armor held perfectly. Schroeder's modifications made the difference. O'Neill joined them, nodding with satisfaction at the gun's performance. 4 hits, 4 kills. Can't ask for better than that. Captain Reynolds approached his expression, one of profound respect. Colonel Thornton, your tank just changed the equation. For the first time, we can go toe-to-toe with T-34s. Not my tank, Captain. It belongs to your men now. Reynolds shook his head. This is your creation, Colonel, your vision. The brass needs to know what happened in here today. They need to understand what this tank can do. Jack nodded. I'll make sure they do. As they prepared to return to Pusan, Jack gazed back at the battlefield. The burning hulks of North Korean T-34s stood as mute testimony to the Sherman Gladiators' effectiveness. They had done it, created a weapon that could save American lives in this brutal conflict. But Jack knew their victory today was only the beginning. The real battle still lay ahead, the fight to convince the military hierarchy that the Sherman Gladiator deserved full production. Harrison would still oppose them, using his influence to protect his preferred programs. What had changed was that Jack now had something Harrison couldn't dismiss: proof from the battlefield itself. The Sherman Gladiator had faced the enemy and triumphed. As they drove back to Pusan, Jack began composing in his mind the report he would send to General Davis. The facts were clear, the implications undeniable. The Sherman Gladiator worked. The question now was whether that would be enough to overcome the politics, institutional resistance, and bureaucratic momentum that had nearly killed the project before it began. For Jack and his team of forgotten veterans, the struggle continued. But for the first time since arriving in Korea, Jack allowed himself to feel something like hope. They had created something that mattered, something that worked. And no amount of opposition from Harrison or anyone else could change that fundamental truth. The Sherman Gladiator had proven itself in combat. Now it was time to take the fight back to Washington. The military transport plane touched down at Andrews Air Force Base with a jolt that roused Jack Thornton from his uneasy slumber. Through the small window, he watched as the Maryland landscape came into view, gray and cold under February skies. After nearly 2 months in Korea, the manicured grounds of the military base seemed surreally peaceful. Jack gathered his worn leather briefcase containing the most important cargo he had ever carried: a comprehensive battlefield assessment of the Sherman Gladiator, including combat photographs, kill confirmations, and testimonials from tank crews. Evidence that could not be dismissed by even the most stubborn Pentagon bureaucrat. As the plane taxied to a halt, he noticed a staff car waiting on the tarmac, General Maxwell Davis standing beside it. Jack straightened his uniform, knowing that the real battle was about to begin. "Welcome home, Jack." Davis extended his hand as Jack descended the aircraft steps. "You look like hell." Jack smiled wearily. "Combat will do that to a man, Max, even at my age." They climbed into the car, Davis dismissing the driver to ensure privacy. "Your reports made quite an impression." Davis pulled away from the aircraft. 4 confirmed T-34 kills in the first engagement. 6 more in subsequent actions. The Gladiator's performance exceeded even your projections. The men did the real work. I just pointed them in the right direction. Davis nodded, then his expression grew serious. "Harrison's been busy while you were away. He's filed formal charges, Jack. Misappropriation of military property, falsification of documents, insubordination. The works. I expected as much. He's powerful, Jack. Has the ear of the Joint Chiefs. Despite the success in Korea, he's still pushing to shut down the Gladiator program, claiming it diverts resources from the Pershing." Jack stared out at the passing landscape. "The Pershing is a fine tank, Max, but we need both. The Gladiator can be produced faster, deployed sooner. We've proven that." "I know. That's why I've arranged a special hearing before the Armed Services Committee tomorrow. Your chance to make the case directly to the people who control the purse strings." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Congressional oversight? Harrison must love that. He's furious. But with your combat results, I convinced them this deserves their attention. It's your one shot, Jack. Make it count." Jack patted his briefcase. "I intend to." They drove in silence for a while before Davis spoke again. "There's something else. Your son Robert has been wounded in Korea." Jack's head snapped up. "How bad?" Not critical. Tank took a hit. He's being treated at Walter Reed, arrived stateside last week. Jack closed his eyes momentarily. His son had been serving with an armor unit near Seoul, but their paths hadn't crossed during Jack's time in Korea. I need to see him. Of course. I've arranged for you to have the afternoon free before tomorrow's hearing. The car turned toward Walter Reed Army Medical Center, its imposing buildings visible in the distance. One more thing, Jack. Davis's voice dropped. Harrison will be at the hearing. He'll do everything possible to discredit you and the Gladiator. Be prepared. Jack nodded grimly. I've been fighting men like Harrison my entire career, Max. Men who see soldiers as statistics, tanks as budget items. This time I won't lose. Walter Reed Hospital hummed with quiet efficiency as Jack made his way through corridors filled with wounded men from Korea. Young faces marked by experiences no young man should endure. Jack moved among them with the reverence of one who understood precisely what they had sacrificed. He found Robert in a ward reserved for recovering officers. His son lay in bed, his right arm and shoulder heavily bandaged, reading a magazine with his good hand. At 28, Robert had his father's strong features, though his hair remained dark without the silver that now dominated Jack's. Hello, son. Robert looked up startled, then broke into a grin. Dad, they didn't tell me you were coming back stateside. Jack embraced his son, carefully mindful of the injuries. Just arrived. How bad is it? Robert shrugged his good shoulder. Tank took a hit. Shrapnel caught me pretty good, but I'll keep the arm. Doc says I should regain full function eventually. Jack pulled a chair beside the bed, studying his son with a father's critical eye, noting the weight loss, the shadows beneath his eyes. Your tank? M24 Chaffee. We were screening for an infantry advance when we ran into a T-34. Our round bounced off. Theirs didn't. Robert's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jack heard the underlying tension. 3 of my crew made it out. Gunner didn't. Jack nodded, understanding too well. I've been working on something that might help with that problem. The Sherman Gladiator. Robert smiled at Jack's surprised expression. Word travels fast, Dad. Some of the guys rotating back talked about a souped-up Sherman taking out T-34s like they were target practice. Said some retired colonel was behind it. News to me that it had a name. Jack smiled slightly. So it's real? You're the one who created it? Jack nodded. Me and a team of very talented veterans. We modified the Sherman with the 90mm gun, better armor, improved fire control. Makes it a match for the T-34. Robert whistled appreciatively. Wish we'd had some in my sector. Might have saved a lot of good men. He paused, studying his father. Something tells me this wasn't exactly an official project. It is now. Congressional hearing tomorrow to determine its future. And yours, I'm guessing. Jack shrugged. That's less important. They talked for over an hour, Jack sharing edited highlights of his time in Korea, while Robert spoke of his own experiences. The conversation flowed easier than it had in years, a shared language of combat, bridging the distance that had grown between them after Jack's wife Robert's mother had passed 5 years earlier. As visiting hours neared their end, Robert fixed his father with a serious look. Dad, what you did with this tank sounds like it could save a lot of lives. That's the plan. Then you can't let them shut it down, whatever it takes. Robert's voice hardened. I've seen too many friends die because their equipment wasn't good enough. Don't let politics get more men killed. Jack squeezed his son's good hand. I won't. You have my word. As Jack prepared to leave, a nurse entered with medication for Robert. She was perhaps 40, with auburn hair, pulled back in a practical style, and intelligent eyes that assessed Jack with professional interest. You must be Colonel Thornton. Robert's told me about you. She extended her hand. Margaret Hayes, head nurse for this ward. Pleasure, ma'am. Jack shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip. Dad, Nurse Hayes, served in MASH units in Korea. Just rotated back last month. Robert explained. 3 different MASH units. She corrected measuring medication with practiced efficiency. Saw more tank injuries than I care to remember. Jack studied her with newfound interest. Perhaps you could spare a few minutes of your time, Nurse Hayes. Your experience might prove valuable for a project I'm working on. She raised an eyebrow. The famous Sherman Gladiator? Robert mentioned it. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I'd be happy to discuss my observations, Colonel, for the good of our boys overseas. Jack left with not only his son's encouragement, but the promise of expert medical testimony about tank crew injuries, another piece of evidence for tomorrow's hearing. The battle ahead remained daunting, but for the first time since returning, Jack felt the momentum shifting in their favor. The hearing room in the Rayburn House office building buzzed with activity, as Jack arrived the following morning. General Davis met him in the anteroom, briefing him on the format. 5 members of the Armed Services Committee will hear testimony. First Harrison, then you. Each side presents its case 15 minutes for questions, then they deliberate. Simple majority determines the recommendation to the full committee. Jack nodded, adjusting his uniform. He had chosen to wear his full-dress uniform with combat ribbons, a calculated decision to remind everyone that he was a soldier who had earned the right to speak on matters of war. Harrison's already inside with his staff, been working the members all morning. And our side? Washington arrived from Detroit early today. Thompson and Schroeder are here too. Rodriguez and O'Neill are still in Korea with the prototype, but they've sent written statements. Jack felt a surge of gratitude for his team, their continued support even in his absence. Max, I need to ask a favor. Name it. If things go badly, if Harrison prevails, I need assurances that the others won't face charges. They were following my orders. Davis studied his old friend. Always the commander protecting your men. That's the job. I'll do what I can, Jack. But let's focus on winning this fight, not planning for defeat. They entered the hearing room, taking seats at a long table facing the raised dais where the committee members would sit. Across the room, General Harrison conferred with his aides, his face set in lines of determination. Jack nodded to Washington, Thompson, and Schroeder, who sat in the row behind him, ready to provide technical support if needed. Nurse Hayes had also arrived as promised, taking a seat nearby, her uniform, crisp, her expression professional. At precisely 10 o'clock, the committee members entered, led by Congressman Howard Phillips, a veteran of the Pacific Campaign who now chaired the Subcommittee on Military Procurement. This special hearing of the Armed Services Subcommittee on Procurement will come to order, Phillips announced. We are here to evaluate the Sherman Gladiator tank modification program, its effectiveness, cost, and alignment with current military strategy. He shuffled papers before continuing. This is not a court-martial or disciplinary hearing. Those matters will be addressed through appropriate military channels. Our sole concern is whether this program merits continued funding and support. Jack noticed Harrison's frown deepening at the statement. The general had clearly hoped to use the proceedings to advance his case against Jack personally. General Harrison, you may begin. Harrison approached the witness table impeccably dressed, his manner authoritative. For 20 minutes, he presented a thorough case against the Sherman Gladiator program. His arguments were logical, focusing on resource allocation, competing priorities, and established procurement procedures. The M26 Pershing is already in production, Harrison concluded. It offers superior armor firepower and battlefield effectiveness compared to any modified Sherman. Diverting resources to the Gladiator program undermines our long-term strategic objectives to address a short-term tactical situation. The committee members listened attentively, several nodding at Harrison's points about fiscal responsibility and standardized equipment. Thank you, General. Phillips turned toward Jack. Colonel Thornton, you may present your case. Jack approached the witness table, placing his briefcase before him. He began not with technical specifications or cost analyses, but with a photograph, a stark black and white image of a burned M24 Chaffee tank, its crew laid out beside it under ponchos. This was taken 2 months ago near the Pusan perimeter. Jack's voice was steady. The tank commander, Lieutenant James Wilson, was 23 years old. His gunner, Corporal David Martinez, was 20. Driver PFC Thomas Chen, 19. Loader PFC William Jackson, 18. Jack placed another photograph on the table. This is what killed them, a Soviet T-34 85 tank. Its 85mm gun outranges the M24's 75mm. Its armor is impervious to the M24's rounds from most combat engagement distances. He continued methodically, building his case with battlefield evidence rather than abstract concepts. Combat photographs, damage assessments, comparative penetration data. The Sherman Gladiator addresses this immediate threat. It converts existing vehicles into effective countermeasures against the T-34. In combat tests in Korea, the Gladiator achieved a 4-to-1 kill ratio against enemy armor. Jack introduced statements from frontline commanders' testimonials from tank crews who had operated the Gladiator in combat. He presented Nurse Hayes, who spoke briefly but powerfully about the patterns of injuries she had treated and how improved armor could reduce casualties. The M26 Pershing is an excellent tank, Jack acknowledged, but production and deployment timelines mean it won't reach Korea in sufficient numbers for months. The Sherman Gladiator can be fielded now using existing platforms and manufacturing capacity. He concluded with a direct appeal. This isn't about competing procurement programs or budget allocations. It's about American lives. Every day we delay means more young men coming home in body bags or with injuries that will haunt them for life. The committee room had fallen completely silent. Even Harrison's staff had stopped their whispered conferences. "Thank you, Colonel." Phillips cleared his throat. "We'll now proceed to questions." For the next 15 minutes, committee members probed both presentations. Harrison fielded questions about production schedules and strategic planning, while Jack addressed concerns about standardization and maintenance requirements. As the questioning neared its end, Harrison made his final move. "Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd like to introduce one last piece of evidence." Phillips nodded. Harrison produced a folder. "These are the service records of Colonel Thornton's team, a collection of men who couldn't adjust to military or civilian life after the war. Men with disciplinary problems, alcohol issues, psychological instabilities." Jack stiffened, his expression darkening. Colonel Thornton himself, while decorated for valor, was repeatedly passed over for promotion due to his unorthodox methods and inability to work within established command structures. Harrison closed the folder with a satisfied expression. "I submit that this entire project represents not a rational military procurement decision, but the personal crusade of a group of disaffected veterans unable to accept that their time has passed." The committee room erupted in murmurs. Phillips gavelled for order. "Colonel Thornton, you may respond." Jack stood slowly, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "General Harrison is correct about one thing. My team is composed of men who struggled after the war, men who didn't easily fit back into peacetime society." He paused, looking directly at Harrison. "What the general fails to understand is why. These men saw the worst of combat. They watched friends die, sometimes because their equipment wasn't good enough. That experience changes you, marks you in ways that those who haven't experienced it can never fully comprehend." Jack gestured toward his team seated behind him. "Captain Washington holds engineering patents that have improved every tank in our arsenal. Sergeant Rodriguez can diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. Der Schroeder's armor designs are years ahead of current thinking." His voice strengthened. "These men didn't fail to adjust to society. Society failed to recognize their worth. The Gladiator program gave them a chance to use their hard-won knowledge to save lives. And they succeeded beyond all expectations." The room had gone completely still. Even Harrison seemed taken aback by the quiet intensity of Jack's response. "As for my own record," Jack continued, "I have always placed the well-being of my men above politics, careerism, or blind adherence to procedures that cost lives. If that makes me unorthodox, so be it. I would make the same choices again." Phillips studied Jack for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, gentlemen. This committee will deliberate and deliver its recommendation by the end of the day." Dismissed. As the room cleared, Jack found himself face-to-face with Harrison in the narrow corridor outside. "Impressive performance, Thornton." Harrison's voice dripped with sarcasm. The combat veteran fighting for his men. "Very touching." "It wasn't a performance, Harrison." "Perhaps not, but it won't matter. The committee understands the bigger picture, the proper channels, decisions made by those with the appropriate authority." Jack stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Have you ever seen the inside of a burning tank, Harrison? Smelled the flesh of young men cooking in their own vehicle? I have. So have the men you just disparaged." Harrison's expression faltered briefly before his mask of authority returned. "The charges against you still stand, Colonel. Regardless of the committee's decision, you'll face court-martial for your actions. If that's the price for getting the Gladiator to Korea, I'll pay it gladly." They parted, Harrison returning to his staff while Jack rejoined his team. Washington placed a supportive hand on Jack's shoulder. "You did well in there, Jack. Spoke the truth. Will it be enough?" Washington shrugged. "Truth against politics? Hard to say." They spent the afternoon in a small conference room Davis had arranged, reviewing their presentation, identifying points. They could have strengthened planning next steps regardless of the outcome. At 4:30, a congressional aide entered with a sealed envelope. "The committee's decision, Colonel Thornton." Jack opened it, reading quickly before looking up at his anxious team. "The committee recommends immediate funding for 30 Sherman Gladiator conversions, with an option for 50 additional units based on combat performance." The room erupted in celebration. Washington pounded Jack's back, while Thompson allowed himself a rare smile. Even Schroeder, the reserve German engineer, looked pleased. Davis shook Jack's hand vigorously. "Congratulations, Jack. You did the impossible." "Not me, us, all of us." The celebration was interrupted when another aide appeared at the door. "Colonel Thornton, there's a General Ridgway on the secure line for you." Jack exchanged surprised glances with Davis. Matthew Ridgway had recently taken command of all UN forces in Korea following the death of General Walker. In a private office, Jack took the call, putting it on speaker so Davis could hear. Colonel Thornton, this is General Ridgway. Yes, sir. General Davis is with me as well. Good. I'll be brief, Colonel. I've reviewed the combat reports on your Sherman Gladiator. Impressive results. I want more of them, and I want them now. The Armed Services Committee just approved production of 30 units, sir, with options for 50 more. Not enough. Ridgway's voice was clipped efficient. I'm planning a counteroffensive to push the North Koreans and Chinese back above the 38th parallel. I need every edge I can get. Sir, the production capacity is about to expand dramatically, Colonel. I've spoken directly with the President. He's authorizing emergency production measures similar to what we implemented in 1942. Detroit Tank Arsenal will begin immediate conversion of Sherman tanks to your Gladiator specifications. Jack felt momentarily speechless. Presidential authorization meant the program was now beyond Harrison's reach. There's more, Ridgway continued. I want you back in Korea, Colonel, as technical advisor to 8th Army headquarters. Your experience with these modifications will be invaluable as we deploy them in combat. General Harrison has filed charges against Colonel Thornton, sir. Davis interjected. Court-martial proceedings are pending. Are they now? Ridgway's tone suggested this was a minor inconvenience. General Davis, please inform Harrison that all charges against Colonel Thornton and his team are suspended by my direct order. National security interests take precedence. Yes, sir. Davis couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. Colonel Thornton, I expect you in Tokyo for briefing next week. Your team as well. The Sherman Gladiator just became a top priority. We'll be ready, sir. After the call ended, Jack sat in stunned silence. Davis laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. Looks like you won after all, Jack. And not just the battle, the entire damn war. Jack allowed himself a brief smile before the responsibility settled on him again. We've got work to do, Max. Lots of it. Those tanks need to be ready before Ridgway launches his offensive. Always the commander. Davis shook his head. Take a moment to enjoy the victory, Jack. You've earned it. Jack nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead, planning production schedules, training programs, battlefield deployment strategies. The Sherman Gladiator had moved from unauthorized experiment to presidential priority in the span of a few months. Now they had to deliver on its promise. 1 week later, Jack stood on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base preparing to board a military transport bound for Tokyo. With him were Washington, Rodriguez, O'Neill Thompson, and Schroeder, the core team reassembled for their new mission. General Davis had come to see them off. Production is already underway at Detroit. First batch of 10 Gladiator ships next week, 30 more the week after. And Harrison? Jack couldn't help asking. Davis smiled. Reassigned to Logistics Command in Alabama, about as far from Korea or tank development as possible. Jack nodded, satisfied. Harrison had been neutralized not by personal revenge, but by the simple triumph of a better idea. As the team prepared to board a staff car approached, to Jack's surprise, Robert emerged wearing his uniform, his injured arm still in a sling. Reporting for duty, sir. Robert saluted his father with his good arm. What are you talking about? You're on medical leave. Robert grinned. Not anymore. General Ridgway approved my request for limited duty as liaison officer to the Gladiator program. Said something about keeping it in the family. Jack looked to Davis, who shrugged innocently. Nothing to do with me, though I may have mentioned to Ridgway that Robert had extensive combat experience with armored units. For the first time since returning from Korea, Jack felt something tight within him loosen. His son would be with him, not in combat, but working alongside him, ensuring that other young men had better protection on the battlefield. Behind Robert, another figure emerged from the car. Nurse Hayes in travel uniform carrying a medical kit. Don't look so surprised, Colonel. She smiled at Jack's expression. The Gladiator program needs medical oversight to document how the improvements affect casualty patterns. General Ridgway approved my temporary assignment to your team. Jack glanced at his son, who failed to hide a knowing smile. Clearly, Robert had played some role in arranging this particular addition to the team. As they boarded the aircraft, Jack took a moment to observe his expanded team. Veterans and young officers, engineers and soldiers, each bringing unique skills and perspectives united by a common purpose to save lives in a distant war. The Sherman Gladiator had begun as a desperate improvisation, a stopgap measure born of necessity. It had become something more, a symbol of what could be accomplished when experience and innovation were valued above procedure, when the needs of frontline soldiers took precedence over politics and bureaucracy. Jack settled into his seat as the engines roared to life. Ahead lay months of intensive work ensuring the Gladiators reached the battlefield in time for Ridgway's offensive. There would be new challenges, technical problems to solve, resistance to overcome. But for the first time since Korea erupted into conflict, Jack felt genuine hope. The tanks they had created would protect American lives, turn the tide of battle, vindicate the sacrifices of all who had fought to make them reality. As the aircraft lifted into the dawn sky, Jack thought of the young tank crews who would soon man the Gladiators. Boys like the ones he had commanded in Europe, like those Robert had led in Korea. Boys who deserved every advantage their country could provide. This time they would have it. April 1951, 8th Army Headquarters, Korea. Jack stood on a hillside overlooking the assembly area where the newly arrived Sherman Gladiators were being prepared for their first major offensive. Below him, 57 of the modified tanks formed neat rows, their 90mm guns raised slightly in travel position. 3 months of intensive work had transformed the Gladiator from prototype to frontline weapon. Production teams in Detroit, working around the clock, had converted existing Sherman tanks at a pace that would have seemed impossible before the war. Training programs developed by Jack's team had prepared crews to maximize the tank's capabilities. Now they would face their greatest test, Operation Thunderbolt, Ridgway's counteroffensive, to push enemy forces back across the 38th parallel. Robert joined him on the hillside, his injured arm now healed enough for limited duty. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Robert nodded toward the tanks. "Harrison said it couldn't be done." "Harrison was wrong about many things. The men are ready. Training scores are the highest I've seen. They believe in these tanks." Jack nodded, watching as crews performed last-minute maintenance checks. Many were veterans of earlier battles against T-34s, men who had seen comrades die in outmatched vehicles. Their dedication to mastering the Gladiators had been total. "What about the Chinese armor?" Robert asked the question on everyone's mind. Intelligence reports indicated that Chinese forces had reinforced the North Koreans with their own tank units, including the newer IS-2 heavy tanks, with 122mm guns powerful enough to threaten even the improved Shermans. "The IS-2 is formidable," Jack acknowledged, "but sluggish with a slow reload time. The Gladiator's mobility gives it an edge if the crews use proper tactics." Thompson approached, clipboard in hand. "Final readiness report, Colonel. All units operational. Ammunition stocks at full capacity. Medical units briefed on new evacuation procedures." Jack had insisted on improved medical response protocols based on Nurse Hayes' recommendations, ensuring that any tank crew casualties would receive treatment within the critical first hour after injury. "Thank you, Doctor." Jack had taken to using Thompson's civilian title, recognizing how the man's medical knowledge had improved crew survivability. Washington and Rodriguez joined them, having completed their own inspections. O'Neill remained with the tanks, providing last-minute guidance to gunners. "The modifications are holding up well, Sam?" Jack asked. Washington nodded. "Better than expected. Combat data from the early deployments led to some additional reinforcements around the turret ring. Should improve crew survival even if penetrated." Rodriguez wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "Engines are running at peak efficiency. New air filters handling the Korean dust better than standard equipment." Jack felt a surge of pride in his team. They had overcome every obstacle, technical and political, to deliver on their promise. American tank crews now had a fighting chance against enemy armor. A jeep approached, carrying General Ridgway himself. The commander of all UN forces in Korea had taken personal interest in the Gladiator program following its early combat successes. "Colonel Thornton," Ridgway greeted Jack with a firm handshake. "Your tanks ready for tomorrow?" "Yes, sir. All units combat ready." Ridgway surveyed the assembly area with an experienced eye. "Good. They'll spearhead the advance through the Chip-Yongni sector. Intelligence reports heavy armor concentration there." "The crews understand the mission, sir. They won't let you down." Ridgway studied Jack with shrewd assessment. "You know, Harrison still has friends at the Pentagon. Some who say these modifications were unnecessary, that we should have waited for the next generation of tanks." "What do you say, sir?" Ridgway smiled thinly. "I say I've seen the combat reports, seen the difference in casualty figures before and after the Gladiators deployed. That tells me everything I need to know." The general prepared to depart, then paused. "You've done good work here, Colonel. Saved a lot of lives. Remember that, whatever happens tomorrow." "Thank you, sir." After Ridgway left, Robert turned to his father. "You're going forward with the advance tomorrow, aren't you?" Jack nodded. "Observation position with the command group. Need to see firsthand how the tanks perform in a major offensive." Robert looked like he might protest, then thought better of it. He understood his father well enough to know that Jack Thornton would never remain safely behind while others tested his creation in combat. That evening, Jack gathered with his core team in the command tent, reviewing the operational plan one final time. The Sherman Gladiators would lead the armored thrust, with infantry following to secure captured ground. Artillery would provide initial suppression, but once the advance began, the tanks would operate largely independently. Primary objective is breakthrough and exploitation. Jack traced the route on the map. Enemy armor will likely concentrate here and here. Our tanks need to engage at optimal range using their superior fire control to advantage. The team discussed contingencies, technical considerations, last-minute adjustments. As the meeting concluded, Jack addressed them collectively. Whatever happens tomorrow, this team has accomplished something remarkable. You took an obsolete platform and transformed it into a weapon that's saving American lives. No matter what the official records say, that's a legacy to be proud of. Washington raised his coffee mug in a toast to the Gladiator and the men who made it possible. The Gladiator, the others echoed. Jack left the tent, finding the night air cool and refreshing after hours of planning. Stars sparkled overhead, seemingly untouched by the war raging beneath them. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of artillery, a constant backdrop to life near the front. He was not surprised when Margaret Hayes joined him. In the months since leaving Washington, she had become not just a valuable member of the team, but a personal comfort to Jack. Her practical wisdom and quiet strength complemented his more driving nature. "Can't sleep, Colonel?" She stood beside him, gazing at the stars. "Just thinking. Tomorrow will tell the tale one way or another." She nodded, understanding. "The men believe in the Gladiator, Jack. More importantly, they believe in you. I just hope I've given them enough of an edge." Margaret touched his arm gently. "You've given them everything you could. Sometimes that has to be enough." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as occasional flares illuminated the distant front lines. Tomorrow those lines would change as thousands of men and machines launched the largest counteroffensive since the war began. "Be careful tomorrow, Jack." Margaret's voice held concern she rarely displayed. "The men need you to come back." Jack turned to her, seeing in her expression something that went beyond professional concern. "I will. That's a promise." Dawn broke clear and cold over the Korean peninsula. Jack joined the command group in an armored personnel carrier positioned to observe the initial advance. Through binoculars, he watched as the Sherman Gladiators formed their attack formations, engines rumbling in the morning air. At precisely 0700, the artillery opened fire, hundreds of guns creating a rolling barrage ahead of the assault force. Under this covering fire, the tanks began to move forward, their formation disciplined and purposeful. Jack felt the familiar tension of combat even in his observer role. Those were his tanks, his design carrying young Americans into battle. Their performance would validate or refute everything he had fought for these past months. The advance proceeded rapidly, at first the enemy seemingly surprised by the weight and speed of the attack. Jack watched through binoculars as the Gladiators crossed the first phase line right on schedule. Then the reports began coming in. "Contact Sector 2, enemy armor T-34s and IS-2s, Gladiators engaging." Jack listened intently as unit commanders reported the first tank battles. Through his binoculars, he could see distant flashes as main guns fired the black smoke of burning vehicles rising against the morning sky. Charlie Company reports 3 T-34s destroyed, 1 Gladiator damaged not destroyed. Alpha Company engaging IS-2 heavy tanks. 2 destroyed, 1 Gladiator lost. The pattern continued as the advance pushed deeper into enemy territory. The Sherman Gladiators were taking losses but significantly fewer than predicted, inflicting heavy damage on the opposing forces. By midday, the breakthrough was complete, enemy forces in full retreat. The command vehicle moved forward, allowing Jack to see the results firsthand. Destroyed T-34s and IS-2s littered the battlefield, smoking hulks marking the path of the advance. More importantly, he saw Gladiators still operational, despite battle damage. Their improved armor, having saved crews who would have perished in standard tanks. Robert found him examining a Gladiator that had taken a direct hit from an IS-2. The massive 122mm round had penetrated the hull, but the modified ammunition storage had prevented a catastrophic explosion. 3 of the 4 crew members had survived. "It's working, Dad." Robert's voice held wonder and pride. "Everything you designed, everything you fought for, it's actually working." Jack nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he surveyed the battlefield. For every destroyed American tank, he counted 3 or 4 enemy vehicles permanently disabled. The breakthrough had succeeded beyond even Ridgway's optimistic projections. That evening, as reports from all sectors confirmed the operation's success, Ridgway himself visited the forward command post. Remarkable performance, Colonel. The general studied the battle maps where American forces had advanced farther than planned. Your gladiators broke their main armor formations, allowing our infantry to exploit the gaps. The crews deserve the credit, sir. They executed perfectly. Ridgway shook his head. Don't diminish your achievement, Thornton. Without these tanks, we'd still be fighting a defensive action. Now we have the initiative. He handed Jack a folder. Orders from Washington. You're to return to the Pentagon immediately to oversee expansion of the program. They want 200 more gladiators as soon as possible. Jack felt conflicting emotions. Pride in the validation, but reluctance to leave Korea while the offensive continued. Sir, I'd prefer to remain with the units, at least until the operation concludes. Ridgway smiled, understanding. The commander never wants to leave his men, but you've done your part here, Thornton. Others need your expertise now. Jack knew the general was right. The Sherman Gladiator had proven itself in the largest tank battle of the Korean War. His responsibility now was to ensure that success was built upon that more American lives would be saved by his team's creation. 2 days later, Jack stood on the airfield preparing to board the transport that would take him first to Tokyo, then back to Washington. With him were Washington, Thompson, and Schroeder, all recalled to oversee the expanded production program. Rodriguez and O'Neill would remain in Korea maintaining the existing gladiators and training new crews. Robert, too, would stay continuing his liaison duties, now fully recovered from his injuries. Margaret Hayes approached as Jack completed his preparations. Their relationship had deepened during their time in Korea, becoming something neither had expected to find amid war. So you're leaving us, Colonel. Her tone was light, but her eyes revealed deeper emotions. Only temporarily. I'll be back once the production expansion is established. She smiled knowingly. The Pentagon will find reasons to keep you there, Jack. You're too valuable now. He took her hand, a gesture bold for a man of his generation and background. Then perhaps you should consider a transfer to Walter Reed. They always need experienced combat nurses. Margaret's smile widened. Are you offering me a job, Colonel Thornton? I'm suggesting we might have more to discuss than tank armor and medical protocols. She squeezed his hand briefly. I'll consider it. After all, someone needs to keep you from working yourself to death. Their farewell was interrupted by the arrival of General Ridgway, accompanied by several staff officers and a photographer. Colonel, before you leave, we have some unfinished business. Jack stood at attention, puzzled. Ridgway produced a small box. By order of the President of the United States, I am authorized to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross for exceptional valor and service to your country. Jack remained at attention as Ridgway pinned the medal to his uniform. The citation mentioned his work on the Sherman Gladiator program and his extraordinary contribution to the war effort, resulting in numerous American lives saved. The ceremony concluded with photographs, Jack uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its symbolic importance. The Sherman Gladiator program had been validated at the highest levels, the efforts of his team recognized officially. As he finally boarded the aircraft, Jack gazed out at the Korean landscape where in the distance, the offensive continued, American forces pushing steadily northward. Among them were dozens of Sherman Gladiators, their distinctive profiles visible even from afar. From obsolete relics to battle winners, from forgotten veterans to honored innovators, from improvised solution to official doctrine. Jack settled into his seat as the aircraft lifted off, carrying him back to Washington, where new challenges awaited. The Sherman Gladiator would continue to evolve, production would expand its influence, would extend to future tank designs. But for Jack Thornton, the true measure of success would always be simpler, more profound. The lives saved the young men who returned home because a small team of aging veterans refused to accept that their time had passed, refused to allow bureaucracy to triumph over battlefield necessity. Some would call it his legacy. Jack preferred to think of it as his duty fulfilled at last. 20 years later, Fort Knox, Kentucky, the dedication ceremony for the new Armored Forces Museum drew a substantial crowd. Military personnel, local dignitaries, and veterans gathered under a clear autumn sky. At the center of the museum's main hall sat a Sherman Gladiator, one of the original production models. Its battle scars preserved, its 90mm gun still pointed defiantly forward. Jack Thornton, now 78, moved slowly but with dignity toward the podium. 2 decades had added lines to his face, whitened what remained of his hair, but his blue eyes remained sharp, alert. Margaret, his wife of 18 years, walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Robert, now a general himself with the modern armored division, waited near the podium. As Jack prepared to speak, he surveyed the audience. Thompson was there looking remarkably unchanged beside Washington, whose hair had turned silver. Rodriguez and O'Neill sat together in the front row, both still robust despite their years. Schroeder had passed away 3 years earlier, but his widow had come representing the German engineer whose brilliance had helped save American lives. Today we dedicate not just a museum, but a testament to what can be accomplished when innovation triumphs over convention, when the experience of combat veterans is valued over theoretical doctrine. Jack's voice carried clearly across the gathering. The Sherman Gladiator was never meant to be revolutionary. It was born of necessity, created to address an urgent battlefield need when young Americans were dying in outmatched vehicles. He gestured toward the tank behind him. This particular Gladiator fought at Chip-Yongni, destroyed 4 enemy tanks, saved its crew when hit by a 122mm round. It represents hundreds like it that changed the course of the Korean War. Jack paused, looking directly at his assembled team. But the true story isn't about machines. It's about people. Veterans whose wisdom was nearly lost, men whose talents were overlooked until necessity demanded their recall. The audience listened in respectful silence as Jack recounted the journey from unauthorized experiment to presidential priority. He spoke of the battles both in Washington and Korea, the obstacles overcome, the lives saved. The lesson of the Sherman Gladiators is not just about tank design or battlefield tactics. It's about recognizing that experience has value, that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that sometimes the old soldiers still have much to contribute. As he concluded, Robert joined him at the podium, unveiling a bronze plaque that would permanently accompany the displayed tank. It listed not only the technical specifications and combat record, but the names of every member of the original team. The Sherman Gladiator program directly saved an estimated 1,200 American lives in Korea. Jack's voice softened with emotion. For those of us who created it, that number will always be our greatest achievement, our most meaningful legacy. After the ceremony, as attendees toured the museum, Jack found a quiet moment with his original team. They gathered around the Gladiator, each man touching the battle-scarred armor, with reverence, remembering their younger selves and the mission that had given them purpose when society had deemed them obsolete. "We did good, didn't we, Jack?" O'Neill asked, his voice gruff with emotion. "We did, Frank. Better than anyone thought possible." Washington smiled, running his hand along the modified turret, and changed tank design for a generation. The M60 used our concepts for ammunition storage and crew protection. Rodriguez patted the hull affectionately. "Not bad for a bunch of burnouts and misfits, eh, Colonel?" They laughed together, sharing the special bond of men who had accomplished something extraordinary against overwhelming odds. As the museum emptied, a young lieutenant approached Jack somewhat hesitantly. "Colonel Thornton, sir, I just wanted to thank you personally. My grandfather was a tank commander in Korea, served in a Gladiator with the 8th Tank Battalion. He always said your tank saved his life." Jack shook at the young officer's hand. "What's your grandfather's name, son?" "Reynolds, sir, Captain James Reynolds." Jack's eyes widened in recognition. "I remember him. Good officer. Took the first Gladiator into combat." "Yes, sir. He never forgot what you did. Inspired me to join the armor branch." After the lieutenant left, Margaret took Jack's arm. A nice moment to end the day. Jack nodded, watching it as the museum staff secured the building for the night. The Sherman Gladiator would remain on display, teaching future generations about innovation, persistence, and the value of experience. "We won't be forgotten after all," Jack said softly. "No, Jack." Margaret squeezed his arm gently. "Neither the tanks nor the men who made them." They walked together toward the exit, leaving the Gladiator behind, its 90mm gun still raised as if ready for one final battle. A battle it had already won, not just on distant Korean hills, but in the halls of the Pentagon, the factories of Detroit, and now the memories preserved within these walls. A testament to men who refused to believe their time had passed, who found purpose in serving their country one last time, who proved that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from the expected sources, but from those society had too readily dismissed. The forgotten veterans who had ensured that others would be remembered.